Tonight, picture one cold morning arriving in 7 different beds at the same hour. It is the 10th of January in the middle years of the 1500s, and a hard frost has come down over the whole of England in the night, so that every field from the Scottish border to the chalk cliffs of the south wears the same gray furred coat. In a river palace of warm red brick, in a chamber hung with green and gold, a duchess lay under a coverlet of squirrel fur and fine Holland linen, while a woman of her bedchamber knelt at the hearth and coaxed a fire that had never quite gone out. 12 miles away, in a stone manor house with a hall and a solar and a fish pond frozen white. A knight's wife woke to the sound of her dairymaid breaking ice in the yard with the flat of a wooden pail. In a walled town, above a shop with a shuttered front, a mercer turned over in a curtained bed and heard his apprentices moving on the boards below. On a chalk upland, in a farmhouse with a stone chimney and a loft of stored grain, a yeoman was already dressed and standing in his doorway, judging the sky. In a smaller house at the bend of the same lane, a husbandman counted the frozen ruts between his door and his byre and decided which of 2 jobs could wait. And at the lane's end, in a single low room with a smoke hole and an earth floor beaten as hard as pottery, a laborer and his wife and their household lay close together under one wool blanket and a heap of straw, waiting for the light, because there was no reason in the world to get up before it. The same frost, the same morning, 7 quite different meanings of the word cold. That is the whole of Tudor England held in one picture, and it is where this long, slow, gentle night begins. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself. Let the room go quiet around you. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether, and let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders 1 quiet inch at a time. There is nothing left to decide tonight, and nothing here's going to startle you. This is one turning year told at a walking pace, and you are welcome to fall asleep at any point in it, because it will still be here tomorrow, and so will the frost, and so will the 7 beds. If you enjoy what happens on this channel, a like and a subscribe do help these quiet videos find the people who need them, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments before you drift, because it genuinely helps other sleepless people find their way to this corner of the internet. And there is something companionable about a list of small hours from all over the world stacked up beneath a video about frozen fish ponds. Now, before there was a Tudor England, there was not really a Tudor anything at all. The family that gave the century its name had come out of Wales as stewards and servants, and in the eyes of most of the old nobility, they were an accident of one muddy afternoon rather than a dynasty. The long quarrel between royal cousins that later ages tidied up under the name of the Wars of the Roses had ground on for a generation, not as continuous fighting, but as a sour. Intermittent family argument with sudden violent hours separated by years of watchful peace, and by the time it ended in a Leicestershire field in 1485, a great many of the men who had once held England's counties for the crown were simply gone. Their lands had been forfeited, redistributed, and forfeited again. Their heirs had been condemned, restored, and condemned a second time. Into that emptied space stepped a careful, watchful, deeply unsentimental man who understood better than anybody that the surest way to keep a throne is to make the nobility poorer, the crown richer, and the law slightly frightening. He married the daughter of the rival house, which took most of the sting out of the argument. He kept a court splendid enough to look like a monarchy and thrifty enough to pay for itself. He went through his own account books in his own hand and initialed the pages, which is a habit that ages very well in a king and very badly in a dinner guest. And when he died, he left his son a full treasury and a country tired of fighting, which is close to the best inheritance a young man has ever been handed and close to the worst thing that can happen to a young man's judgment. The son spent it. That is the short version of the century's opening, and it matters here only because it explains the shape of the ladder that everybody in this story is standing on. England in the 1500s was not a country of two classes, the rich and the poor, however easy that is to imagine from a distance. It was a country fascinated by gradation, by rank, by precedence, by who went through a doorway first and who carried whose train, and it sorted itself into rungs so finely divided that a man might spend a whole lifetime resenting the family in the next parish for standing half a step above him. At the top stood the monarch and the royal household, a floating city of somewhere between 800 and 1,500 people that moved from palace to palace as the seasons and the drains required. Below that came the peerage, perhaps 50 or 60 families in the entire realm, dukes and marquises and earls and viscounts and barons, who held land in a dozen counties at once and kept households of 100 servants or more. Below them came the gentry, the knights and esquires and plain gentlemen, several thousand families holding one manor or several, who ran the counties as justices of the peace, and who were the true governing class of England in every practical sense that mattered on an ordinary Tuesday. Alongside them, in the towns, stood the merchants and master craftsmen, some of them richer than the gentry and none of them quite as respectable, at least in the settled opinion of the gentry. Below those came the yeoman, freeholding farmers with land of their own, a stone chimney, a feather bed, and a very strong opinion about the price of wool. Below the yeoman came the husbandman, who farmed as well but on smaller holdings and usually as tenants, and who lived one wet August away from serious trouble. Below them came the cottagers and laborers who had a roof, a garden plot, rights on the common and their own two hands, and who were paid by the day. And beneath everybody, outside the ladder altogether, were the poor without settlement, the wandering, the sick, and the old without kin, whose position in Tudor England was very simple and very unforgiving. 7 rungs, then, counting the way the age itself counted, and this whole night is going to climb slowly up and down them, month by month, through one single turning year, from the frost of January to the banked ember of the following December. It should be admitted at the start that the year did not begin in January for these people, or at least not on paper. The legal year, the year written at the head of a document, began on the 25th of March, the feast of the Annunciation, which everybody called Lady Day. So a clerk writing in February dated his letter to a year we would now call the previous one, and this has caused mild confusion among readers ever since. But the year that people actually lived in, the year of frost and sowing and hay and harvest and slaughter, began where the cold was deepest, and so does this. Consider first the light, because almost nothing in this century makes sense without it. In January in England, the sun comes up somewhere near 8 in the morning and is gone again by 4 in the afternoon, and there was no way whatever to make more of it. Candles were a purchase. Tallow candles, made of rendered mutton or beef fat, smoked and guttered and smelled frankly of dinner, and they were the ordinary light of the ordinary house. Beeswax candles burned clean and bright and sweet and cost 4 or 5 times as much, which is why they belonged to churches and to great households, and why one of the small unspoken luxuries of being a duchess was simply that her rooms smelled of honey rather than of mutton. Rushlights were cheaper still, a peeled rush dipped in fat and gripped in a pinch of iron, burning perhaps half an hour each, standing in for a candle roughly the way a promise stands in for a payment. Below the rushlight there was the fire, and below the fire there was the dark, and the dark is where most of England spent most of its winter evenings. That is one very good reason the Tudors went to bed early, rose early, and had a proverb for absolutely everything. Because a proverb is a thing you can say aloud in a room with no light in it. Consider next the cold itself. The centuries sat inside a long cooling of the northern climate that later scholars named the Little Ice Age, when winters ran harder and longer than in the warm centuries before, and the Thames at London could freeze thick enough to walk across. A great house met that cold with fireplaces and tapestries and layers of wool, and by having enough rooms that the household could simply crowd into the warm ones. A yeoman's farmhouse met it with a stone chimney, which was the great domestic revolution of the 16th century and one of the very few technological changes an ordinary family could actually feel in their lungs. A cottager met it with a hearth in the middle of the floor, no chimney at all. A hole in the thatch and a permanent haze of wood smoke hanging at head height, which kept the thatch dry, kept the insects down, and kept the household's eyes red for life. And everyone on every rung met the night the same way, which was by sharing a bed with other people, because a bed with 3 bodies in it is a warm bed, and a bed with 1 body in it is a cold one. And nobody in the 16th century thought this worth remarking on. Consider next the smell, since it is the thing most often left out of the picture. Wood smoke everywhere, in the hair and the wool and the bread. Tallow, wet wool, which has a particular sweetish, sheepish warmth to it. Animals close by, because in the poorer houses the animals were often in the house, or in the byre end of the same long building behind a low partition, generously contributing their body heat. Ale, brewed weekly in most households and drunk by everybody including the children, not out of dissipation, but because small ale, the weak second brew, was safer than standing water and had calories in it. Onions and pottage. Tanning pits and dye vats at the edge of every town. And underneath all of it, in the towns especially, the ordinary human ripeness of a place with almost no drains, which nobody remarked upon because everybody shared it. Consider, last time, church bells did most of the work a clock does now. A great household might own a mechanical clock, weight-driven, with an hour hand and no minute hand at all, because minutes were not yet something anybody needed to be precise about. Below that level the day was divided by the ringing of bells, by the height of the sun, by the length of one's own shadow, and by the order in which tasks had to be done. A laborer's terms of hire might say that work began at dawn and ended at dusk with an hour of rest at noon in summer. And everybody understood exactly what that meant without a single number passing between them. Many towns rang a curfew bell at 8 or 9 in the evening, first as a signal to cover the fires and afterwards as a general notice that decent people were indoors. Sleep itself came in 2 parts for a great many people, a first sleep from soon after dark until somewhere near midnight. Then a quiet waking hour in which the fire was tended, prayers were said, a neighbor was visited, small tasks were finished, and low conversations were had, and then a second sleep until dawn. That habit runs underneath this entire year like a slow tide, and it is worth holding on to as you drift, because it is a gentle thought. For most of English history, waking in the middle of the night was not a failure of any kind. It was simply the interval. So here is the cast of the year, and they are positions on the ladder rather than individuals, each of them entirely typical and none of them invented beyond what the parish registers, the household accounts. The wills and the probate inventories of the period will comfortably support. There is the court, and inside it a duchess of the old nobility with 3 houses, a wardrobe worth more than a village, and a life shaped almost entirely by her proximity to the person of the monarch. There is a knight's manor in a Midland county, home to a family of the middling gentry with 400 or 500 acres in hand and more let out, a household of 15 or 20 servants, and a place on the Commission of the Peace. There is a walled town with a cathedral and a river, and in it a mercer, a dealer in fine cloth, with a shop, a warehouse, 2 apprentices, a wife who runs the counter and the accounts, and a seat on the town council that he would very much like to keep. There is a yeoman's farm on the chalk, 120 acres of freehold, a flock of sheep, a stone chimney, and a son at the grammar school who may or may not turn out to be the ruin of him. There is a husbandman's holding of 20 acres in the same parish, held by copy of the Manor Court roll, worked by a family that owns 2 cows, a pig, a few geese, and a great deal of anxiety. There is a cottage at the lane's end, with an acre of garden and rights on the common, where a laborer and his wife live by day wages and the strength of their arms. And moving through all of these places there is a whole population of servants and apprentices, mostly young, mostly unmarried, hired by the year at a fair, who made up somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population of the country at any given moment, and who are the great forgotten majority of the 16th century. 7 rungs, 1 year, 1 frost coming down at the same hour on all of them. Let us begin in the deep of the winter, in the short days after the turning of the sun, when the great houses of England were at their loudest and the small ones at their most silent, and let us take it slowly, because there is no hurry at all tonight, and the whole of the year is still ahead of us. January at court did not begin with work. It began with the tail end of an enormous party. The Tudor Christmas did not finish on the 25th of December. It started there and then unrolled through a fortnight of feasting that closed only at Twelfth Night on the 5th or 6th of January, and during those days the royal household became something closer to a small floating town than a family. Fires burned in every chamber that had a chimney. The great hall was hung with holly and ivy and bay, and lit with far more wax than anybody could justify in a normal week. A Lord of Misrule was appointed, an officer of pure nonsense whose entire commission was to organize disorder, and for those 12 days he could order the household about, stage mock ceremonies, appoint absurd offices, and make gentle fun of people who on any other morning of the year would have had him removed from the room. Disguisings and masks filled the evenings, with painted canvas castles wheeled into the hall, musicians in a gallery, dancing that went on for hours, and courtiers in costumes so expensive that a single sleeve represented a laborer's wages for a year. Play was constant, and money changed hands over it, at cards, at dice, at tables. There were gifts to be exchanged on New Year's Day, and this was not a casual custom, but a piece of political theater with a scoreboard. Every gift given to the monarch was recorded on a long parchment roll, And so was every gift the monarch gave back, usually gilt plate weighed to the ounce, so that a courtier could work out precisely where he stood in favor by the weight of silver he took home. A duchess in that hall spent the 12 days on display and at work, whatever it looked like from the gallery. Her business was placement, patronage, and marriage. Whose daughter would be taken into whose household? Whose son needed a license, a wardship, a lease of crown land, a pardon for some tedious quarrel in a distant county? Which family had risen this month, and which had gone quiet? She wore, over those days, cloth of gold if her rank allowed it, and rich velvet if it did not, with a gown of perhaps 12 or 15 yards of fabric, a stiffened bodice, a farthingale that made the skirt stand out from the hips, sleeves pinned in and out as the day required, and a headdress that hid nearly all of her hair. She was dressed by 2 or 3 women, and it took the better part of an hour. She could not sit down quickly, bend easily, or move without being noticed, which was the point of the entire arrangement, since a body that cannot hurry is a body that does not work for its bread. And when the 12 days ended, the household simply stopped. The hall went cold. The court packed itself into carts. Because a palace of 1,000 people fouls its own drains within a few weeks, the whole court removed to another house so that the first could be scoured and aired, a process the household politely called making it sweet again. Down the ladder, in the knight's manor house, Christmas had been generous and much smaller. The hall was open to the parish for several days, which was a genuine obligation and not merely a kindness, because a gentleman's local standing rested on being seen to keep a good house. Tenants came in and were fed. A boar's head might appear if there was a boar. Musicians came from the town. There was dancing at the lower end of the hall and cards at the upper, and the family's plate stood out on the cupboard where everyone could count it. Then the 12th day passed, and the house came down to its winter self, which was quieter, smaller, and largely concerned with accounts, since the steward's books had to be squared before the spring. In the town, the mercer's Christmas was also a trading season, and also a civic one. Guild feasts filled the calendar, each craft with its own hall or its own room in an inn, its own livery of matched cloth, its own candles burning before its own saint, until the religious changes of the century made that particular custom awkward and then illegal and then quietly nostalgic. The town waits, the official band of musicians, went about the streets in the dark mornings. Apprentices were given a holiday and a certain license to be foolish in it, and on the farms the 12 days were the one true holiday of the laboring year, the only stretch in which a husbandman genuinely did no field work at all beyond feeding the animals, because the animals do not observe feasts. Then, on the first Monday after Twelfth Night, England went back to work, and it did so with a ceremony that says almost everything about the country. It was called Plough Monday. In parish after parish across the Midlands in the north and the east, the young men of the village dragged a plough through the streets decorated with ribbons and collected money at the doors for the plough light. A candle kept burning in the church for the good of the season's tillage. They dressed up. There was often a man in women's clothes and a fool with a bladder on a stick, and there was dancing, and the money went to the parish, and at the end of it the plough was returned to the field, and the actual, unromantic, back-breaking work of the year began. That is a very Tudor sequence of events. Ritual first, then labor, and the ritual paid for the light. What did January work actually consist of for the 4 rungs who worked with their hands? It consisted of the tasks that could be done in cold weather on frozen or waterlogged ground. Threshing, above all. The grain harvested in August lay in the barn in the straw, and all winter long it had to be beaten out of the ear with a flail, which is two sticks joined by a leather hinge. Swung in a rhythm hour after hour in the half-dark of the barn, with the doors open at both ends so that the drought could carry the chaff away when the grain was winnowed. Threshing was the great winter employment of the English laborer. It was tedious, it was noisy, it was the reason barns were built as they were, and it was paid by the quarter of grain threshed rather than by the day. Hedging and ditching came next. A hedge was laid by cutting the upright stems almost through and bending them over along the line, weaving them between stakes so that the living wood grew into a stock-proof barrier, and a well-laid hedge would hold cattle for a generation. Ditches were scoured out so that the spring rain would run somewhere useful. Timber was felled in winter when the sap was down. Wood was carted, sawn, and split. Firewood was the household's fuel almost everywhere except the coal districts near Newcastle and the seacoast towns that could take sea-coal by ship, and gathering it was a daily task that fell largely to women and children, who had the right in most manners to take dead wood by hook or by crook, which is to say what they could pull down with a hook and what they could reach with a crooked staff, and no more. Sheep on the winter pasture were watched and folded and fed with hay if the snow lay. Cattle stood in the byre, eating the summer's hay, dropping the manure that would go back on the fields, which is the quiet mechanism at the center of the whole system. Since the amount of grain a village could grow was set by the amount of manure it could make, and the amount of manure was set by the number of animals it could feed through the winter, and the number of animals was set by how much hay it had cut in June. Everything in the Tudor countryside was a loop, and the loop was tight. In the house, January was the season of the distaff and the spinning wheel. Wool had to be carded and combed and spun, and virtually every woman in England spun, from the laborer's wife who did it by firelight to fill the gaps in the day, to the yeoman's wife who ran it as a household business, sending the yarn out to be woven by the parish weaver and taking back cloth. Flax was heckled and spun into linen thread for shirts and smocks and sheets. Clothes were mended, patched, cut down, turned, and handed on. Nothing was thrown away. The inventory of a poor household taken after a death might list an old coat, a pair of hose, 2 shirts, a kettle, a pot, a pan, a chest, a bedstead, a coverlet, a pair of sheets, and a spinning wheel. And that could be the entire material wealth of an adult life, and it would still be worth listing because it would still be worth inheriting. Food in January was the food that had survived the autumn. Bread, first and always, and the kind of bread you ate placed you on the ladder as accurately as your hat did. White wheaten manchet bread, fine and pale, was for the gentle table. Beneath that came cheat bread, wheat with more of the bran left in. Beneath that came maslin, a loaf of wheat and rye grown and threshed together, which was the ordinary bread of much of the country. Beneath that came rye alone, and beneath that, in a hard year, horse bread of beans and peas and whatever grain there was, which was exactly what it sounds like. Pottage came with it, a thick standing broth of oats or barley with peas and beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, and whatever herbs the garden held, simmered in a single pot over the fire and improved by a piece of bacon, if there was one. Salted and smoked meat from the autumn slaughter hung in the roof. Cheese and butter had been laid down in the summer and were rationed. Ale was brewed weekly. Apples were kept in a loft, wrinkling, and the winter garden gave leeks, colewort, onions, garlic, and a few roots, since the potato had not yet arrived and would not become an English field crop for another 2 centuries. At the top of the ladder, the winter table looked entirely different, not because of vegetables, which were considered slightly beneath a gentleman, but because of meat and spice and sugar. A great household ate roasted and boiled flesh at both of its main meals, beef and mutton, capon and coney, venison from the park, swan and heron and bittern for a feast, seasoned with pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron, and sugar, all imported at enormous cost. And the dishes came in courses of many at once, so that a diner chose from what stood near him rather than eating everything set down. Sugar was medicine as well as luxury, which meant the rich rotted their teeth thoroughly and the poor kept theirs, a small piece of justice that nobody at the time regarded as a comfort. The frost, meanwhile, went on. It closed the roads by making them hard, and then closed them again by thawing and making them bottomless. It froze the mill stream so the miller could not grind. It killed the weak sheep and the old and the very young of the parish, and the burial entries in January and February in a Tudor register run heavier than in any other months of the year. And it made the evening long. In the great house the evening was filled with music, cards, chess, tables, reading aloud, and the enormous business of getting undressed. In the manor house it was filled with the same things at a smaller scale and with an earlier bedtime. In the town it was filled with talk and accounts and the curfew bell. And in the cottage at the lane's end it was filled with the fire, the spinning. One rushlight if there was a reason for one, a shared pot, prayers, and then the 2 sleeps with the whole household breathing in the dark under the smoke-blackened thatch, waiting out the longest quarter of the year, in the reasonable and correct expectation that the light would come back. February arrived with the Feast of Candlemas on the 2nd day, 40 days after Christmas, and it was one of those hinges in the year that everybody at every rung felt at once. In the older world of the century's first decades, Candlemas meant a procession of lit candles through the parish church, the whole congregation carrying flames, the year's supply of candles blessed at the altar, and a general sense that the dark half of the year had been formally shown the door. When the religious changes came, the procession went, then came back, then went again. And by the end of the century a parish might keep the date without the candles, and the old people would remember and say nothing. But the farming meaning of Candlemas never changed at all. It was the day by which half the winter fodder ought still to be in the barn. A husbandman who had already fed out more than half his hay by the 2nd of February was in trouble and knew it, and would spend the next 8 weeks watching the grass and praying for an early spring. There was a proverb about it, as there was about everything, and the proverb was not sentimental. If Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another flight. A fine February in England is not a gift. It is a warning. February was also when Lent began, on a movable date, and Lent in the Tudor century was a piece of national machinery rather than a private devotion. For roughly 40 days, no meat. Not for the Duchess, not for the laborer, not for anyone without a license, and licenses existed and could be bought for the sick and the old and the pregnant, but the general rule stood and was enforced by church wardens who noticed things. What replaced meat was fish, and fish in this period meant overwhelmingly salted or dried preserved fish, because fresh sea fish could only travel as far inland as a horse could carry it before it turned. Stockfish, which is cod dried until it is essentially wood, had to be beaten with a hammer and then soaked for a day before it could be cooked at all. Salt herring came in barrels by the thousand. There were also freshwater fish from the moat and the stew pond, which is precisely why any manor house of any pretension had a fish pond, and why the frozen white oval outside the knight's window in January was not decoration, but a larder. And then there were the fish days outside Lent. Fridays and Saturdays and the eves of feasts were also meatless, which meant that something close to a third of the year was legally fish. Later in the century, the government added more fish days by statute, and it did so with a candor that is almost charming, admitting plainly that the purpose was not religion, but the maintenance of the fishing fleets, and therefore of the sailors who would be needed in a war. Parliament, in effect, put a nation on a diet in order to keep its navy manned. For the wealthy, Lent was an inconvenience answered by ingenuity, and cooks produced elaborate almond milk sauces, fish molded to look like meat, and enough spice to make dried cod feel like an occasion. For the poor, it was one more turn of a screw that was already tight, because February and March were the hungry gap, the season when the autumn stores were low and nothing new had come in. This is the point in the year when the difference between the rungs stops being a matter of comfort and starts being a matter of arithmetic. The Duchess ate 500 calories of imported spice a week out of curiosity. The laborer's family ate less bread in February than in November because there was less bread. In a bad year, the parish would see it in the burial register by March. So how did the poorer rungs get through it? Partly by the garden, which every cottage had, and which mattered far more than its size suggests, growing leeks and onions and garlic and colewort and beans and peas and herbs. Partly by the common, where a family with rights could graze a cow or a few geese, cut furze and bracken for fuel and bedding, and glean and gather. Partly by credit, which is the invisible structure of the entire Tudor economy, since almost nobody paid cash for anything immediately and almost everybody owed small sums to their neighbors, recorded in memory and in scratched tallies settled at harvest or at Michaelmas. Partly by charity, which was real and organized and local, distributed by the parish, by the churchwardens. By bequests and wills that left a shilling to the poor of the parish on the day of the funeral, by doles of bread at a tomb, and partly, in the worst cases, by the road, which is the darkest thread of the century and which we will come to at Michaelmas when the vagrancy laws bite. February was the season of illness. The Tudors did not know what caused disease, and their theories were coherent, elegant, and entirely wrong. The body was governed by 4 humors, blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile, and health was their balance, and imbalance was corrected by diet, by heat and cold, by purging, and by bleeding. A physician, university-trained, expensive, and the only medical man entitled to call himself doctor, examined urine in a glass flask, held it to the light, considered the patient's stars, and prescribed. A surgeon, trained by apprenticeship and ranked lower, set bones, lanced boils, stitched wounds, amputated, and in the towns was often the same man as the barber, since both trades required a sharp blade and a steady hand, which is the origin of the striped pole. An apothecary compounded the medicines, and below and around all of them, treating perhaps 9/10 of the actual illness in England with the women. The wise woman of the parish, the mother, the grandmother, the midwife. They used a herbal pharmacy that was partly nonsense and partly extremely good, since willow bark does contain the ancestor of aspirin, Honey is genuinely antibacterial, garlic and onions do something, and a warm bed. A broth and somebody watching you through the night is not nothing. A gentlewoman was expected to keep a still room and a book of receipts, half cookery and half medicine, copied from her mother and added to over a lifetime, and to physic her own household and often her tenants as well. This was regarded as a duty of rank, and it was one of the few forms of authority a woman of the gentry held that nobody argued with. Childbirth belonged to the same female world. A laboring woman was attended by a midwife and by her gossips, the women of her family and neighborhood, in a darkened room with the windows covered and a fire kept in, and no man present, including the physician. Unless something had gone very badly wrong indeed, the midwife was licensed by the church, not by any medical body, chiefly so that she could baptize an infant in danger of dying, which tells you what the priorities were. Roughly 1 birth in 40 killed the mother, which sounds survivable until you remember that a married woman might give birth 8 or 10 times, so that the risk compounded across a life into something close to 1 woman in 20 or 30. Perhaps a quarter of all children died before their first birthday, and something like a third before the age of 10, and this was true in the palace as much as in the cottage, because wealth bought food and warmth, but bought nothing at all against infection. A month after the birth, if she lived, the mother came to church to be churched, a service of thanksgiving and reintegration, after which she took up her ordinary life. Then she did it again the following year. In the town, February was a slack month for trade, and a busy one for the courts and the council. The rivers were high or frozen, the roads were foul, the carriers came late. And the coastal shipping that carried most of England's heavy goods sat in harbor, because the sailing season in the narrow seas ran roughly from spring to autumn, and no sensible master took a laden ship round the coast in February. The mercer used the quiet weeks to take stock, to chase debts, to write letters to his factor in London, and, if he was ambitious, to attend the meetings that mattered. A town of any size governed itself through a corporation, a mayor and alderman, and a common council, elected from a narrow group of the wealthier freemen, and beneath that lay the guilds, which controlled who might practice a craft, how long an apprenticeship must run, what quality of work was acceptable, and what a man might charge. This was not free trade and was never meant to be. It was a system designed to keep quality high, competition civil and prices stable, and to make sure that a young man who put in 7 years of apprenticeship could reasonably expect to become a master, marry, keep his own shop, and take apprentices in his turn. The apprentices themselves lived in their master's house, ate at his table, slept under his roof, were fed and clothed and disciplined by him, and were bound by an indenture that forbade them to marry, to gamble, to haunt taverns, or to wear finery. They broke every one of those rules constantly. The records of the town courts are full of it, and they were fined, whipped, forgiven, and bound over. And then they served out their years and became respectable and complained bitterly about the apprentices. Meanwhile, at the manor, February was when the gentleman of the house did the thing that made him a gentleman in the eyes of the state. He served as a justice of the peace. The commission of the peace in each county was the crown's arm reaching down into the villages, and it was staffed by unpaid local gentry who heard petty cases, examined suspects, bound over quarreling neighbors, licensed alehouses, punished those who failed to attend church, set the rates of wages, and sent the serious matters up to the quarter sessions and the assizes. 4 times a year the justices met in the county town for the court of sessions, and twice a year the royal judges came round on circuit for the assizes, and a great deal of England's social order rested on that arrangement. It was cheap for the crown, since it cost almost nothing, and it flattered the gentry, who wanted the standing, and it worked well enough for 200 years, and its weakness was obvious and permanent, which is that the man judging a dispute about a hedge often owned the land on one side of it. March turned the year over, and it did so on paper as well as in the fields. The 25th of March was Lady Day, the first of the 4 quarter days by which England ran its money, the other 3 being Midsummer on the 24th of June, Michaelmas on the 29th of September, and Christmas on the 25th of December. On a quarter day, rents fell due, servants' wages were reckoned, leases began and ended, debts were called in, interest was paid. And the whole enormous web of small obligations that held the country together was pulled tight and inspected. Lady Day was also, as we have seen, the first day of the legal year, so a document written on the 24th of March and another written on the 26th belonged to different years entirely, which every clerk understood and every later reader has cursed. For the tenant farmer, Lady Day was the day the rent had to be found, in coin or in kind or in a mixture of both. For the copyholder who held his land by copy of an entry in the Manor Court roll, it meant appearing at the Manor Court, that ancient and remarkably durable institution in which the Lord Steward presided and the tenants themselves acted as the jury presenting offenses, recording surrenders and admissions of land, fining men for letting their pigs into the wheat, for not scouring their ditch, for taking more than their share of the common, for brewing bad ale, and for selling it in the wrong measure. The Manor Court was slow, local, deeply concerned with hedges, and it was the closest thing most English people had to a government they could actually see. The land these people were arguing over looked nothing like modern farmland. Over much of the Midlands the parish still farmed in open fields, 2 or 3 great unfenced fields divided into hundreds of narrow strips, each family holding scattered strips in every field so that good and bad land was shared out. One field lay fallow each year to recover, and the fallow was grazed by the village's animals, whose manure went back into it. Beyond the fields lay the meadow, which produced the hay and was the most valuable land of all, and beyond that the common and the waste, where the poorest wights lived. All of it was farmed by agreement, in a sequence everybody had to keep to. Because if your neighbor's strip lay across your headland, you could not plow until he had, and if the village turned its beasts onto the stubble on a fixed day, then nobody could leave a crop standing past it. It was a system that made cooperation compulsory, which is a polite way of saying it made quarreling constant. In the West and the North and in Kent, the pattern was different, with older enclosed fields hedged and ditched and held in severalty, and more pasture and less of the collective machinery. And running through the whole century, quietly and then not quietly at all, ran enclosure. Enclosure meant hedging land that had been open, and it might be a sensible tidying up by agreement between neighbors, or it might be a landlord throwing 3 holdings together, putting sheep on them and turning families off, and the century's writers, preachers, and rebels made no attempt to distinguish between the two. Wool paid. Wool paid far better than grain for much of the period. English cloth was the country's overwhelming export, and a flock needs a shepherd, and a boy where 100 acres of arable needs a dozen households. So villages emptied. Some vanished outright and left the green humps and hollows in the turf that you can still walk over on an English hillside in low evening light. The government legislated against depopulating enclosure repeatedly and enforced it feebly. Commissions were sent out. Hedges were pulled down by angry crowds in more than one summer, and a famous sentence of the time complained that sheep had begun to eat men. That sentence was not poetry. It was land economics with the volume turned up. Meanwhile, the actual work of March was plowing and sowing. The plow was a heavy wooden frame with an iron share and coulter and a mold board to turn the furrow, drawn by oxen, usually 4 or 6, sometimes 8 in heavy clay, walking at a deliberate 2 miles an hour and requiring a man at the plow and a boy at their heads. Horses were faster and were coming in, but oxen were cheaper to keep, could be eaten at the end, and did not mind clay. An acre a day was a good day's plowing. The spring sowing was of barley, oats, peas, and beans, the winter sowing of wheat and rye having gone in the previous autumn. Seed was broadcast by hand from a sheet or a hopper slung at the waist, thrown in an arc timed to the walking pace, then harrowed in, and then defended against birds by children with clappers, which was one of the first jobs a village child was given, and one of the few that could be done while daydreaming. The yield was poor by any modern standard, perhaps 4 grains harvested for every one sown in a decent year on decent land, and rather less on tired land, out of which the next year's seed had to be kept back before anybody ate anything. That single ratio explains almost everything about the century, because it means the margin between enough and not enough was one bad August wide. In the gardens, March meant sowing too, and the Tudor garden was a working thing before it was a pretty one. Cabbages, coleworts, leeks, onions, garlic, parsnips, carrots, turnips, skirrets, beans and peas, with a bed of pot herbs and physic herbs at the edge, rosemary and sage and hyssop and rue and fennel and marigold. The great house had all that, and then had, in addition, the display garden, the knot garden, with its interlacing hedges of box and lavender clipped low, and the spaces between filled with colored earth or flowers, geometrically satisfying, entirely artificial, and best appreciated from an upstairs window, which is exactly where the family looked at it from. Orchards were planted, and this century saw a serious improvement in English fruit, with new apple and pear and cherry varieties brought from the continent, particularly into Kent, and a fashion for grafting that a gentleman might practice with his own hands and then talk about for the rest of the year. In the household, March was the season of the great cleaning, the airing of beds and bedding, the beating of hangings, the fresh strewing of floors. A word about floors is in order. In the hall of a manor house, the floor was often strewn with rushes and herbs, changed periodically, and the old story that they were left to rot for years is mostly a slander lifted from one appalled foreign visitor. Below that level, the floor was beaten earth, swept hard, sometimes sealed with a mixture of clay and ox blood, which sounds gruesome, and produced a smooth, dark surface that could be washed. Above it, in the newer and richer houses, floors were boards, and boards meant an upper story, and an upper story meant chambers, and chambers meant privacy, and privacy is the single greatest luxury the 16th century introduced to English domestic life. This is the moment to say something about that change, because it was happening all through the year and all through the century, and later historians named it the Great Rebuilding. For 200 years, English housing had barely altered. Then, from the middle of the 1500s onward, ordinary, prosperous people, yeoman and husbandman and townsman began to rebuild their houses in a new way. They put in a chimney stack, which took the smoke out of the room. Once the smoke was out of the room, they could floor over the open hall and make bedchambers above. Once they had bedchambers, the household stopped sleeping communally around the hearth and began to sleep in separate rooms, parents in one, children in another, servants in a third. They glazed the windows, since glass was coming down in price, where before there had been shutters and oiled cloth. They acquired furniture, and the probate inventories show it arriving decade by decade. First bedsteads, then chests, then chairs instead of stools, then cushions, then hangings, then plate. One writer of the period noted with a certain wry pride that old men in his village remembered when there were only 2 or 3 chimneys in the whole parish, and when a man slept on a straw pallet with a good round log for a pillow, and that they thought their sons had gone soft. They had not gone soft. They had gone warm, and it changed everything about how a family lived, argued, prayed, and raised children. Down at the cottage, the great rebuilding arrived late or not at all, and the laborer's house at the end of the century still had 1 room, 1 hearth, 1 door, and a loft reached by a ladder. But even there, the century had made a difference, because the laborer's wife almost certainly owned a metal cooking pot her grandmother would have envied, and a pair of sheets, and a chest with a lock on it, and the lock is the interesting part, because a lock implies something worth locking up. So March closed with the ground turned, the seed in, the rent paid or promised. The manor court adjourned, the house swept, the fish ponds thawed, and the days at last the same length as the nights. Somewhere in the 4th week, the first swallow was noted, and the noting of it was a serious business, recorded in commonplace books, because a countryside without newspapers keeps its records in the sky. April belonged to Easter, and Easter belonged to a church that changed its mind under royal instruction 4 times in 50 years. It is worth pausing here, gently and without drama, because nothing else in the century reached so far down the ladder or so far into an ordinary house. At the opening of the 1500s, England was a Catholic country of an unusually enthusiastic domestic kind. Parishes were rebuilding their churches with their own money. Guilds maintained lights before saints. People left money in their wills for masses to be sung for their souls, for years, or for decades, or in perpetuity, and the whole cycle of the year was studded with processions, blessings, holy days, and rituals that a laborer's family took part in as fully as a duke's. The church was the parish's social calendar, insurance office, theater, and memory. Then the king wanted a new marriage. The pope would not give it, and within a decade the monarch had made himself supreme head of the church in his own realm. What followed touched every rung. The monasteries, which held perhaps a quarter of the land in some counties, were dissolved. Their houses were stripped, their lead roofs melted, their libraries scattered, their communities pensioned off, and their estates sold to the crown servants and to the gentry and the merchants who could raise the money, which created in one generation a large class of families whose wealth, and therefore whose loyalty, was bound to the new settlement, which was very largely the point. The pilgrimage shrines went. The images were taken out of the churches, then in some reigns put back, then taken out again. The wall paintings were lime-washed over. The Latin Mass became an English service, then went back to Latin, then became English again. The chantries were abolished and their endowments taken, which ended at a stroke the entire industry of praying for the dead and closed a good many small schools that had been attached to them. Church ales, the parish's cheerful fundraising drinking festivals, were disapproved of and thinned out. The number of holy days was cut sharply, which the government presented as a measure to increase honest labor, and which the laboring poor experienced as the loss of about a fortnight of paid holiday a year. Ordinary people responded to all this in every possible way. Some welcomed it fiercely. Some hid the parish's silver and its best vestments in a farmhouse loft and waited. And in more than one parish they were still there when the wind changed. Some rose in open rebellion, in the north over the monasteries, and in the west over the English prayer book, and were put down with the usual severity. Most did what most people do, which was comply outwardly, grumble privately, bury their parents according to whichever rite was legal in the month they died, and keep the parts of the old year that could survive without a priest. That is why so many of the customs in this story have a slightly worn look by the end of the century, kept up out of habit and neighborliness rather than doctrine. Like a house whose owners have changed, but whose paths still run where they always ran. So Easter in April meant, depending on the decade, either a great sequence of ceremonies or a plainer service in English, but in every decade it meant the end of Lent and the return of meat, and the whole country felt that in its stomach. It also meant the annual communion, which almost everybody took at Easter and rarely otherwise, and which required being at peace with one's neighbors, so that the weeks before Easter were the season for patching up quarrels, sometimes under the firm eye of the church wardens. It meant the paying of Easter dues to the priest. And it meant, in the older calendar, the shutting up of Lent with games, and afterwards Hocktide, a rowdy fundraising custom in which on one day the women of the parish caught and bound the men and demanded a coin for their release, and on the next the men returned the favor, and the money went to the church, and everybody enjoyed themselves considerably more than the surviving church wardens. Accounts quite admit. Then came the sober business of spring. April was lambing on the chalk and the moor, which meant men and boys sleeping out in the fold with the flock, lanterns, hurdles, and the constant patient work of persuading a ewe that has lost her lamb to take an orphan, usually by skinning her dead lamb and tying the fleece on to the stranger, which worked, because a ewe knows her lamb by smell. Wool was the country's engine, and sheep were everywhere, and the flocks ranged from a cottager's 2 or 3, grazed on the common, up through the yeoman's few hundred to the great graziers with many thousands. April was also the first grass, the moment the winter fodder question was finally answered and the surviving animals could be turned out. Thin and unsteady, on to the new growth. Cows came back into milk. Butter and cheese making began again, and the dairy was a woman's kingdom in every rank, from the laborer's wife with 1 cow to the great house's dairymaids working under the eye of the mistress. Calving and lambing and the return of the milk meant that April and May were, quite suddenly, the best-fed weeks the poor had known since the autumn. In the town, April brought the roads back. The carriers resumed their weekly runs, the pack-horse trains moved, and the coastal ships came out of harbor, so the mercer's warehouse began to fill. The great cloth trade turned. English broadcloth and kersey went out through London to Antwerp in enormous quantities, unfinished, to be dyed and dressed abroad, and the profits of that trade built a great many of the fine timber-framed houses that still lean over English market streets. Later in the century, when the Antwerp market convulsed, English merchants scattered outward in search of new ones, to the Baltic and Russia and the Levant, and eventually much further. And companies were formed by charter to do it. But in the ordinary April of an ordinary town, the trade was cloth, and the mercer's business was a matter of credit, quality, and reputation, all of which traveled at the speed of a horse. April was also the season for building, and the century built magnificently. The nobility raised prodigy houses of glass and symmetry designed principally to be visited by the monarch, with long galleries running the whole length of an upper floor for walking in bad weather and looking at portraits, great windows in quantities that neighbors considered showing off, and a plan arranged so that a visitor moved through a sequence of increasingly private rooms, from the hall to the great chamber to the withdrawing chamber to the bedchamber, each one a smaller and more flattering audience. The gentry built more modestly in brick and stone. The yeoman put in his chimney and his floor. And everyone who built used what was under their feet, which is why English building is a geological map, timber and plaster in the wooded clay, flint in the chalk, limestone in the belt that runs across the country, cob and thatch in the west, and gritstone in the north. Wardrobe, meanwhile, marked out the latter as sharply as the buildings did, and the state took an interest. Sumptuary laws laid down in detail which ranks might wear which fabrics and colors. Cloth of gold and purple silk were reserved for the highest nobility. Sable belonged to the top of the ladder, velvet and satin were pegged by income, and the ordinary Englishman was to wear wool and, on Sundays, a woolen cap, a rule kept alive partly for public order and partly because the cappers of England had a good lobby. The laws were broken constantly by ambitious young men and enforced sporadically, but the underlying reality did not need enforcing. Cloth was expensive, dye was expensive, and a laborer's coat represented weeks of wages and was worn until it fell apart and then was worn some more. Color was the giveaway. Rich saturated blacks, which took enormous quantities of dye and skill, and deep crimsons and true purples announced money. Undyed wool, russet and gray and the various sad shades of brown, announced the absence of it. A duchess in black velvet and a laborer in undyed russet were not simply dressed differently. They were dressed in different amounts of human labor, and everybody who saw them could count it at a glance. And so, April ended with the countryside green. The lambs steady on their feet, the roads open, the ships sailing, the fires smaller. The churches repainted or scraped bare according to the decade, and the entire country beginning to move outdoors again after 5 months of leaning towards a hearth. Before the year goes any further, it is worth going back to that frost. Remember the 10th of January and the 7 beds, and the same hard cold coming down over all of them at the same hour. Follow each of them forward through those first 4 months, and you can see the whole ladder in motion. The Duchess spent that frozen morning at a river palace, and by Candlemas she had moved twice, because the court moved, and by Lady Day she was in London for the law terms and the marriage negotiations, and by Easter she was back in the country and had spent, on clothing alone in that quarter, more than her own gardener would earn in 15 years. She had also lost a nephew to a fever in February, and had written 6 letters about a wardship, and had stood for 4 hours in a cold gallery because the monarch was expected and did not come. The knight's wife at the manor spent the frost morning organizing a household that was feeding 20 people, spent February physicking her tenants with syrups out of her still room, spent March at the manor court listening to a dispute about a pig, and spent Easter week filling the hall. The mercer in the town spent January chasing debts, February at the guild and at the council, March waiting for the roads, and April unloading 3 cartloads of kersey and a bale of Flemish linen and arguing about the customs on it. The yeoman on the chalk threshed through January, watched his hay pile shrink through February, plowed and sowed through March, and lambed through April. And by the end of it had lost 9 ewes and gained 140 lambs, and was, by the standards of his parish, doing extremely well. The husbandman with his 20 acres did every one of those same things with fewer hands, a worse plow and no margin, and by April he had borrowed seed corn from the yeoman, which he would repay at harvest with a little extra, and which was neither cruelty nor charity, but simply how the parish worked. The laborer at the lane's end spent January threshing for the yeoman at so much a quarter, February hedging and ditching for the manor at a set daily rate, March at the plow as a hired hand, and April at whatever came. And his wife spun through all of it and kept the garden and the geese. And their household ate rather better in April than in February, and in a hard year one of the children in a house like that would be in the burial register before the grass came. And the young servants and apprentices moved through all 6 of those houses, hired by the year, sleeping in lofts and truckle beds and over shops, working, saving, and waiting to be old enough and solvent enough to start a household of their own. Same frost, 7 futures. Now to May, which the 16th century enjoyed more than any other month. May Day was the great outdoor festival of the English year, and it belonged to the young. The village went out into the woods before dawn to bring in the May, cutting green boughs and hawthorn blossom to dress the doors and the church porch. A maypole was raised on the green, sometimes an enormous one, and in some parishes it was a permanent fixture that stood all year and became a landmark, and in the sterner decades of the century, a scandal. There was dancing, and Morris dancing, with bells at the knee, and a hobby horse and a fool, and there were games and archery at the butts, which every man was in theory obliged to practice. There were plays and pageants, there was a lord and a lady of the May, and there was a great deal of ale, sold by the churchwardens at a church ale to raise money for the parish, which is a fundraising model of remarkable directness. Preachers of the reforming sort complained about all of it at length, and their complaints are the best surviving description of what happened, which is a common irony in this century. May was also when the courting happened, and Tudor courtship at the lower rungs was far freer than the arranged dynastic marriages of the top rung suggest. Most ordinary English people chose their own partners. They married late at around 26 for men and 24 for women, which is much later than the popular picture, and the reason is economic and simple. Because a couple could not marry until they could keep a household, and keeping a household meant a holding or a shop or a trade, and getting those took years of service and saving. So the years between 14 and the middle 20s were spent in service in other people's houses, and the courting was done at the fair, at the harvest, at the alehouse, on the green, at the hiring, and by the exchange of small tokens, a ribbon, a pair of gloves, a bent coin. A promise made in the present tense in front of witnesses was already, in the eyes of the church courts, a binding marriage which produced a steady stream of complicated litigation and an equally steady stream of banns read in church on 3 Sundays so that everyone could object. Perhaps a fifth of brides were pregnant at the wedding, which the parish took a great deal less hysterically than later centuries would, so long as the wedding actually happened. At the top of the ladder, none of this applied. There, marriage was a treaty. The Duchess's daughter would be matched with a family whose lands lay conveniently, whose politics were currently safe, and whose settlement was negotiated in detail by lawyers, with a jointure specified for the widow and a portion specified for the bride, and the young people concerned might have met twice. Wardship made it sharper still. If a tenant of the crown died leaving an heir under age, the crown took the profits of the estate and the right to arrange the marriage, and could sell that right, and did, so that the marriages of rich orphans were a traded commodity with a public price. This was resented by everyone it touched and defended by the crown as an ancient right. And it was one of the quiet financial engines of the century. Marriage itself, at any rung, made a woman legally invisible in a way that requires stating plainly. Under common law, a married woman's property became her husband's to manage. She could not sue or be sued alone, and she could not make a will without his consent. Her practical power, though, was considerable and utterly essential, because the household was a productive enterprise and she ran half of it. The dairy, the brewing, the poultry, the garden, the spinning, the marketing of small surpluses, the sick room, the children, and often the accounts. A widow, by contrast, stepped straight into full legal personality, could trade, hold land, run the shop, take apprentices, and sign contracts, and a great many did, which is why the widow is such a constant figure in the town records of the period. And at the very top of the century's ladder, of course, the same country that made a wife legally invisible spent nearly half of the 1500s being governed by queens, and managed to hold both ideas in its head at once by deciding that a queen was a special case, which is how most societies handle a contradiction they do not wish to examine. So May ran on, green and loud. The court moved out of London. The gentry rode. The cattle were on the good grass, and the milk was heavy. The sheep were washed in the stream before shearing, driven in and ducked and released, protesting, to dry on the bank. The corn was up and green in the strips, and the whole village walked its boundary in Rogation Week, beating the bounds, a procession round the whole perimeter of the parish, with the priest and the churchwardens and the children, stopping at the marker stones and the old trees. And at each mark a boy was turned upside down, or dunked, or bumped against the stone, so that he would remember exactly where the parish ended for the rest of his life. It was a land registry made out of children, and it worked for centuries. June was the month when the whole country held its breath, because June was hay. Hay decided how many animals survived the following winter, and how many animals survived the winter decided how much manure there was, and how much manure there was decided the size of the harvest the year after that. A wet June was therefore not an inconvenience. It was a 2-year problem. So when the weather turned settled, everybody who could swing a scythe went to the meadow. And the meadow was mown in a line of men moving together at the same rhythm, each a pace behind and to the left of the man ahead, so that the swathes fell evenly, and behind them came the women and older children with rakes and forks to turn the drying grass, and behind them the carts. A good mower could cut an acre in a day and would drink an extraordinary quantity of small ale doing it, provided by the farmer as part of the terms, and would sharpen his blade every few minutes with a whetstone carried in a horn of water on his belt. And the sound of that stone on steel across a valley on a June morning was one of the ordinary noises of English life for 800 years. The hay was cocked, then carried, then stacked, and the stack was thatched over. And if it went up damp, it heated and could burn from the inside, so that the judging of it was a skill that old men were consulted about. Immediately behind the hay came the shearing. The flock was gathered and penned, and the sheep were caught, set on their haunches, and clipped with hand shears in one continuous fleece, which was rolled, tied with its own neck wool, and thrown onto the pile. Shearing was hard-skilled work done by teams that moved between farms, and it was followed by a supper that was one of the fixed feasts of the farming year, with a great deal of meat and rather more drink, and songs, and the wool merchant's man arriving the next morning to look at the clip and offer less than it was worth. That fleece was the beginning of the chain that made England rich. The wool went to a stapler or straight to a clothier, who put it out to be sorted, washed, dyed in some cases, carded and combed, and then spun in cottages by women all over the West Country and East Anglia and the Yorkshire Dales, then woven by weavers on broad looms in their own houses, then fulled at a water mill where great wooden hammers pounded the cloth in a solution of fuller's earth to shrink and thicken it, then stretched on tenter frames in the open air to dry, hooked along the edges, which is where the phrase about being on tenter hooks comes from, then sheared and finished. The clothier owned the wool and the cloth all the way through, and paid each pair of hands a piece rate, and this putting-out system employed more English people than any other industry in the country. It also meant that the cottage in this story, the one at the lane's end with the earth floor, was not outside the national economy. It was inside it, spinning yarn that would be woven 8 miles away, fulled 20 miles away, sold in London and dyed in Antwerp and worn in Poland. June also brought midsummer on the 23rd and 24th, and midsummer in a town was spectacular. There were bonfires in the streets, doors dressed with green birch and fennel and lilies, lamps hung out, and in the larger towns the midsummer watch, a great civic procession in which the mayor and aldermen and the guilds paraded in their liveries with armed men. Giants made of wickerwork and painted canvas, Morris dancers, drummers, and a good deal of self-congratulation. It was the town showing itself its own order, and it cost the guilds a fortune, and they paid it happily because visible rank was the whole point. In the reforming decades, much of this was cut back as superstitious or simply as expensive, and in some towns it faded to a bonfire and a memory. Meanwhile, the quarter day fell on the 24th, so rents came due again, and half the year's servants' wages were reckoned. Then there is the question of what the children of all 7 rungs were doing while this went on. The answer is working, mostly. But the shape of a Tudor childhood is more interesting than that. Very small children were kept close, swaddled as infants, then walked in a wooden frame, then set loose in a yard that contained an open fire, a pond, livestock, and edged tools, which is why the coroner's rolls of the period make grim reading. From about the age of 6 or 7, a child of the laboring rungs began to be genuinely useful, scaring birds, minding geese, gathering sticks, picking stones off the field, carrying food to the harvesters, spinning. From about 12, a child worked seriously, and from about 14, a great many left home altogether and went into service in another household in the same or a neighboring parish, and the sending away was normal and expected and was regarded as the proper way to raise a young person in somebody else's house under somebody else's discipline, learning a trade or a farm or a kitchen. Foreign visitors found this cold and said so. English parents found it obvious. In the towns, apprenticeship formalized the same arrangement into an indenture of 7 years. And the master stood in the place of the father. For the sons of the gentry and above, and for a growing number of the sons of yeomen and merchants, there was school, and the century was a golden age for it. Grammar schools multiplied, some refounded out of the wreckage of the chantries, endowed by merchants and bishops and guilds, and their business was Latin relentlessly. A boy entered at 7, having learned his letters from a hornbook, a sheet of paper with the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer on it, mounted on a wooden paddle behind a leaf of translucent horn. He then spent up to 9 years construing, parsing, memorizing, and speaking Latin from 6 or 7 in the morning until 5 in the evening, 6 days a week. With a fortnight off at Christmas and Easter and a birch rod hanging on the wall as a permanent argument in favor of application. He read the classical authors, learned rhetoric, learned to argue both sides of a question, and came out able to write a letter that would be understood in any country in Europe. A very few then went on to one of the 2 universities at 14 or 15, or to the Inns of Court in London to read law, which was rapidly becoming the finishing school of the gentry, since a landowner who could not follow a lawsuit was a landowner with fewer acres every year. Girls of the gentry were taught at home, and taught well in the better households, reading, writing, accounts, music, needlework, sometimes Latin and modern languages, because a wife who could run an estate while her husband was away at court was an asset, and everybody knew it. Girls of the lower rungs learned what their mothers knew, and, in some parishes, learned to read at a dame school for pennies a week. Literacy by the end of the century has been estimated at perhaps 1/3 of men and rather under 1/10 of women overall, with far higher figures in London and among craftsmen and far lower ones in the fields. But it is worth saying that reading and writing were separate skills, taught separately and in that order, so a good many people could read a printed ballad who could not sign their own name, and the printed word reached far beyond the people who could handle it, because one reader in an alehouse reads aloud to everybody in it. So June ended with the meadows shaved bare and pale, the stacks up and thatched, the wool on its way to the clothier, the bonfires burnt down, the rents paid, and the whole village looking at the standing corn, which had at that point come into ear and was doing the one thing nobody could hurry. July was the month the court went on the road. The Royal Progress was a summer institution, part holiday, part inspection, part enormous piece of theater, in which the monarch and several hundred attendants left London and traveled slowly through a chosen part of the country, staying at the houses of the nobility and gentry and at the corporation towns along the way. It moved perhaps 10 or 12 miles a day. It required hundreds of carts and horses. It stripped the countryside it passed through of provisions, since the royal household had the ancient right of purveyance, buying food and fuel and transport at prices it set itself, which was thoroughly resented and repeatedly complained about in Parliament and never abolished. It also meant that the monarch was seen in the flesh by tens of thousands of people who would otherwise have known their sovereign only as a face on a coin, and that mattered enormously in a country with no police force, no standing army to speak of, and a government that ruled almost entirely by consent, habit, and prestige. For the Duchess in this story, the Progress was the working heart of the year, because access was everything, and access was easiest on the road. For the night at the manor, a visit from the Progress was the single, most expensive honor that could befall a family. Houses were extended for it. Gardens were laid out for it. A gentleman might spend 3 or 4 years of his income entertaining the court for 3 days, and would consider it money well spent, and his descendants would still be showing visitors the room. For the towns, a royal entry meant speeches, gifts of plate, children reciting Latin verses from a scaffold in the marketplace, the conduits running with wine, and the streets cleaned to a standard the town would not attain again until the next rain. And for the laborer whose hay was carted off at a price fixed by a purveyor, it meant something rather less charming. Travel on any other business was slow and worth describing, since it explains why England felt so much larger than it was. The fastest thing in the country was a man on a good horse changing mounts at post stages, who could manage perhaps 60 or 70 miles in a day if the roads and the light allowed. A carrier's wagon, which is how goods and poorer travelers moved, made perhaps 15 or 20 miles a day and ran to a published timetable between the main towns and London on fixed days of the week, which is one of the century's genuinely modern touches. Most heavy goods went by water wherever water existed, since a boat could move a load that would need 30 pack horses, and this is why the coastal trade and the navigable rivers mattered so much, and why sea coal from the northeast was cheap in London and unheard of 40 miles inland. The roads themselves were the legal responsibility of each parish, which was required to provide labor on them for a set number of days each year, unpaid, supervised by a surveyor of highways elected from among the neighbors, an office nobody wanted. The result was a road system that was maintained by people who had no particular interest in the traffic passing through, and it showed. Ordinary people, though, walked 20 miles in a day was unremarkable for a fit adult. A servant walked to the hiring fair. A peddler walked with his pack between villages, carrying pins and laces and ribbons and thread and cheap printed ballads and news, and he was, for many parishes, the entire media industry. July was also the beginning of the sickly season, and it is time to speak about that plainly but gently, because it sat under every rung of this ladder like a floor that might give way. Plague was endemic in England throughout the century, flaring into major epidemics every 10 or 15 years, worst in the towns, and worst of all in London, and worst in summer. When it came, the sequence was always the same. The bills of mortality rose. The wealthy left, which is why the gentry with a country house valued it more in a plague year than in 10 ordinary ones. The theaters and fairs were closed. Infected houses were shut up with the healthy inside them, marked and watched. A policy that was intended to contain the disease and which mostly ensured that every member of an infected household caught it. Parish burial registers show the curve with terrible clarity, a normal year of 24 burials becoming a year of 200. Alongside plague came the sweating sickness, a peculiarly Tudor disease that arrived in a handful of savage epidemics and then vanished from history entirely, killing within hours, striking the young and the well-fed in a way that frightened people even more than plague did, because it seemed to have no rules. And alongside both ran the ordinary constant traffic of typhus, dysentery, smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis, which killed steadily and quietly and never made the chronicles. Against all of this, the medicine of the age could do essentially nothing, and it is important not to sneer at that, because the people involved were not stupid. They observed carefully, they wrote down what they saw, they noticed that plague traveled with people and goods, and they invented quarantine on that observation. They noticed that filth and crowding made it worse, and they legislated about middens and swine in the streets, and they were simply missing one fact that nobody on earth possessed. What they had instead was ritual, community, and comfort. Neighbors nursed, parishes paid women to tend the sick. The dying made their wills, said their farewells, and were attended. And when the epidemic passed, life resumed with a speed that can look callous from a distance and was in fact the only available alternative to despair. Out in the fields, July was the quietest working month of the summer and the hungriest. The hay was in, the corn was ripening and could not be touched, and the tasks were weeding, hoeing, mending, hedging, and the endless watching of stock. This was the gap between the last of the old grain and the first of the new, and in a bad year it was the gap where the granary ran out. Prices peaked in July and August, immediately before the harvest, every single year, which meant that the poorest bought their bread at the highest price of the year and sold their labor in the same weeks. When a harvest failed, and there were several catastrophic runs in the century, the price of wheat could double or treble in months, and since a laboring family spent the great majority of its income on bread, a doubling of the price of bread was not inflation, it was famine. The parishes knew it. Justices were ordered to survey the grain in private barns and compel it to market. Hoarding was denounced from pulpits. Grain riots happened, usually orderly ones in which a crowd stopped a cart of grain leaving the district and sold it at what they considered a fair price and gave the money to the owner, which is a very English kind of riot. Meanwhile, the great house ate exactly as it had eaten in May. That fact, more than any statute, is the honest picture of the latter in July, and it is why the century, for all its music and its grass and its poetry, kept a permanent low current of grievance running through it that surfaced in rebellion roughly once a generation. Then came August, and August was the hinge on which the entire year swung. The 1st of August was Lammas, the loaf mass, when a loaf baked from the first ripe corn was brought to the church and blessed, and it was also the day on which, in many parishes, the hay meadows and certain enclosed fields were thrown open again to common grazing, which is why those places are still called Lammas lands on old maps. From that day, the countryside watched the sky with an attention that is difficult to imagine now. Everything depended on a stretch of dry weather at the right moment. Corn cut too green would not keep. Corn left standing too long shed its grain on the ground or went flat in a storm. Corn carted damp would heat and spoil in the barn and take the year's food with it. So when the farmer judged the moment, the parish went to the field. And the harvest was the one time in the year when the whole ladder bent to the same task at the same hour. Reaping was done with a sickle for wheat, cut high, leaving a long stubble that was itself a crop for thatching and bedding, and with a scythe or a hook and crook for barley and oats. The reapers worked in a line. Behind them came the binders, gathering the cut corn into sheaves and tying each with a twisted band of its own straw. Behind them came the stookers, who stood the sheaves up in pairs leaning against each other, 8 or 12 to a stook, so that the wind could pass through and the rain run off. And then the sheaves stood in the field for a few days to dry and harden, and then the carts came. Everybody worked. The farmer worked, and his wife worked, and the servants worked, and the laborers worked, and their wives and children worked, and craftsmen from the nearby town came out for the harvest wages, and in a good year the yeoman had to go looking for hands and pay over the odds to get them. Wages at harvest were the highest of the year, sometimes double the ordinary daily rate, and they were paid with food and drink included, which mattered enormously, because harvest food was the best food a laboring family saw. Bread and cheese, and bacon and pies, and a barrel of ale in the shade of the hedge carried out by the children. 4 or 5 times through a day that ran from first light to last. The law tried to control these wages. The justices of the peace assessed maximum rates every year at Easter sessions, and the great statute of the century made it an offense to pay or receive more, and required every able-bodied person without other employment to work at the harvest if called upon. In practice, at harvest, the market won, because a farmer with wheat standing in a rising wind will pay whatever is asked and argue about the statute in October. When the last field was cut, the last load was dressed with green bows and ribbons and brought home on the cart with the harvesters riding on top of it, shouting, and there was the harvest supper, the harvest home, given by the farmer in his own barn or hall. This was the great feast of the laboring year. There was roast beef, or at least a great deal of meat by any ordinary standard, plum pottage, cheese, bread, and ale in quantity, and there were songs, and there was a lord of the harvest who had led the reapers and who presided, and there was a general suspension of the usual order for one evening, in which a laborer might say things to a farmer that would be unwise in September. Then everybody went home and the order came back, but the meal was real and the goodwill it bought was real, and the farmer who skimped on it found it harder to hire the following August. After the carts came the gleaning, and gleaning was one of the most important rights the poor possessed. Once the sheaves were carried, the women and children of the parish went into the stubble and picked up every fallen ear, and the custom was jealously protected, regulated by the manor court, opened by the ringing of a bell so that nobody could start early, and closed likewise. A determined family could glean enough grain in a fortnight to make bread for a good part of the winter. It was not charity, it was custom with the force of law behind it, and when enclosure and improved harvesting later took it away, that loss was felt in cottages far more sharply than any statute. In the fields where the crop had failed, of course, none of this happened, and the century saw several sequences of wet summers and ruined harvests. In the middle decades and again badly in the 1590s, when the price of wheat rose beyond anything living memory held, and parts of the north of England recorded genuine starvation deaths in the burial registers, with the word poor or beggar written beside the names. Those years shaped the legislation that followed, and it is worth remembering that the poor laws of this century, which look harsh on the page, were written by frightened men who had watched a market square fill with hungry strangers. While the corn came in, the rest of the produce came in too. The orchard was picked, and apples and pears were stored in lofts on straw or pressed for cider in the West, where cider was the ordinary drink in the same way ale was elsewhere. The hop, newly and controversially arrived from the continent, was picked in Kent, and hopped beer began its long argument with unhopped ale, and argument beer eventually won on the grounds that it kept longer, while a certain kind of older Englishman went to his grave insisting that the stuff was a foreign adulteration. Honey was taken, which meant destroying the hive with sulfur smoke, since there was no other way, and honey was the ordinary sweetener at every rung below the sugar-buying classes, and the wax went for candles. Beans and peas were pulled and dried. Herbs were cut and hung. Nuts were gathered from the hedge in September and stored. And in every cottage garden in England the work of preserving began. Because the difference between a household that ate in February and one that did not was made in the last 3 weeks of summer. This is the right point in the year to open the door of every kitchen at once, because in late summer all 7 of them were full, and the differences between them were at their most visible. Start at the bottom. The laborer's household ate 2 meals, one in the morning and one at the end of the day, with something carried out to the field between them. The center of it was bread and pottage. The pottage stood in an iron or brass pot over the fire and was replenished rather than emptied. Oats or barley thickened with peas and beans, colored with onion and leek and cabbage and whatever green the garden gave, and made memorable by a piece of salted bacon when there was one. Bread was maslin or rye. Drink was small ale, brewed at home or bought from the alewife next door, weak enough that a family drank it all day. Meat was bacon, chiefly from the pig killed in November, and a fowl when a fowl was too old to lay. Cheese, hard and sharp, the kind made from skimmed milk after the butter had been taken, and butter itself has a luxury. Eggs, fish if the parish was near water and the season allowed. A laboring family that had its cottage, its garden, its common rights, its pig and its work, ate a diet that was monotonous, low in fat and sugar, high in fibra, and by no means unhealthy. And it was perfectly adequate in a good year and cruelly inadequate in a bad one, which is the summary of the entire rung. Move up to the husbandman and the yeoman, and the same foods appear in better proportions. More wheat in the bread, more meat, more cheese and butter kept rather than sold, brewing done properly in a brew house of its own. A bacon flitch and a salt beef barrel and a store of dried peas, and by the end of the century, in the yeoman's parlor, pewter dishes on the shelf instead of wooden trenchers, which the inventories record with satisfaction. In the mercer's house in the town, food was bought rather than grown, which is the fundamental difference between a town and a village. And a town household therefore lived by the market and by the assize of bread and ale, a piece of regulation that fixed the weight of the penny loaf against the current price of grain, so that the loaf shrank and swelled through the year while the price stayed put. Bakers who cheated were fined, put in the pillory, and in serious cases drawn through the streets with the offending loaf hung round the neck, and the town enjoyed that thoroughly. A merchant's table had white bread, roast and boiled meats, imported wine on occasion, a sugar loaf kept locked in a cupboard, and spices in small, carefully counted quantities. At the manor, the household ate at long tables in the hall in a rough order of precedence, the family and any guests at the high table on a dais, the upper servants below, the lower servants below them, and a cook and kitchen staff who worked to a rhythm set by the two main meals, dinner in the late morning and supper in the early evening. And at the top, in the great household, the whole thing became an institution with a written establishment, hundreds of mouths fed daily by right, a bakehouse, a brewhouse, a pastry, a larder, a spicery, a buttery for the drink, and a pantry for the bread, and an army of officers who accounted for every joint. The food itself was overwhelmingly protein and cereal. Beef and mutton, veal, pork, capons, geese, ducks, rabbits, and for a feast the showpieces, venison from the park, swans, peacocks, reassembled in their own feathers, herons, and a whole roasted animal on the great days. Vegetables were present but unfashionable, held to be windy and rustic and better suited to the people who grew them, which is one of the more expensive mistakes in the history of English nutrition. Fruit was distrusted raw and welcomed cooked in tarts. Sauces were sharp and sweet at once, thickened with breadcrumbs and almonds, sharpened with verjuice or vinegar and wine, and heavily perfumed with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace and pepper, and the point of spice was never to hide spoiled meat, which is a persistent myth, since anyone who could afford saffron could certainly afford fresh mutton. The point of spice was that it was ruinously expensive, and everybody at the table knew it. Sugar arrived in hard loaves, was broken with nippers, and was worked into marchpane and comfits and preserves and elaborate sugar sculptures that were carried in at the end of a feast and admired, and then eaten. Wine came from Gascony and the Rhine in Spain, and did not keep, and was drunk within the year. And the whole enormous performance was watched by servants who ate the leftovers by right, and after them by the poor at the gate who were given the broken meats, and that chain of leftovers was not sentimental. It was an expected part of what a great household was for. Two habits deserve a moment. The first is the drinking. Every rung drank ale or beer as the ordinary liquid of the day, children included, and the strength varied from the very weak small ale to the strong ale brewed for feasts. The alehouse was the social institution of the village, kept very often by a widow, licensed by the justices, watched by the churchwardens, and it functioned as pub, bank, news agency, hiring hall and courtroom of public opinion. The second is the fire. Every kitchen in England cooked over an open hearth on a wood, or near the coalfields a coal fire with a pot hung from an adjustable hook, a spit turned by a boy or by a dog in a wheel in the grander houses, a bakestone or a bread oven built into the chimney and fired with faggots raked out, and loaded when the bricks were hot enough that a scattering of flour browned in the time it took to say a paternoster, which is how the temperature of every oven in Europe was judged for 1,000 years. And after the eating came the washing, which fell to women and girls at every rung, with water carried from a well or a stream or a conduit heated in a cauldron, used and reused, and lye made from wood ash for the laundry, which was done at intervals of weeks rather than days, and was a heavy, wet, communal, back-breaking business, remembered fondly by nobody at all. September brought Michaelmas on the 29th, the feast of St. Michael, and Michaelmas was the true New Year of practical England. It was a quarter day, so rents fell due again, but it was much more than that. It was when the farming year closed and reopened, when leases turned over, when accounts were audited, when the harvest could finally be counted rather than hoped for, and above all, when servants changed places. The hiring fairs, called statute fairs or mop fairs, were held in the market towns in the weeks around Michaelmas, and they were one of the sights of the century. Young men and women who wished to be hired for the coming year stood in a designated part of the marketplace, each carrying a token of their trade so that a farmer could see at a glance what he was looking at. A carter carried a whip. A shepherd carried a crook or a lock of wool. A dairymaid carried a milking stool or a tuft of cow hair. A general servant carried a mop, which is where the name stuck. A farmer walked along the line, asked questions, looked at hands, and if the term suited, he handed over a small coin as earnest money, a shilling or so, and a bargain was made for a year. The rest of the fair was then spent enjoying that shilling. And the fairground existed to help, with peddlers, ballad singers, cheap ribbons, gingerbread, ale booths, wrestling, and a certain amount of trouble. Then, on the appointed day, the hired servant walked to the new farm with everything owned in a bundle and joined a household of strangers for 12 months. That system, service in husbandry, is the single most underappreciated fact about Tudor society. It meant that the majority of young English people spent their late teens and early 20s living not with their parents, but as members of other households, working for board, lodging, clothing, and a modest annual wage that was paid in a lump at the end of the year, and was, for many, the only saving they would ever do. It meant late marriage, small households, and a labor market that could shift hands from a farm that needed fewer to one that needed more without anybody starving. It also meant that a household was not a family in the modern sense, but a working unit under one roof, a master and mistress with authority over children and servants alike, answerable to the parish for the behavior of both, and legally entitled to correct them within limits that the courts were quite prepared to enforce when a master went too far. Wages themselves were regulated, at least on paper. The justices set the maximum rates for every trade each year, and the surviving assessments are one of the best sources we have. A skilled building craftsman, a mason, or a carpenter might be allowed something like 8 or 9 pence a day with food found, or up to a shilling without. A general laborer might get 5 or 6 pence a day with food, less in winter when the days were shorter, more at harvest, whatever the statute said. A servant in husbandry hired by the year might have somewhere between 1 and 3 pounds for the whole 12 months, plus board, lodging, and often a set of clothing. A woman servant earned about half to 2/3 of a man's rate for the year. Against those numbers, put prices. A chicken might be a few pence, a pig a few shillings, a cow perhaps a pound or 30 shillings, a sheep 3 or 4 shillings. A quarter of wheat, which is 8 bushels and the sort of quantity a household thinks in, ran at perhaps 6 or 8 shillings in a good year in the earlier part of the century, and could pass 40 shillings in the terrible years at the end of it. A pair of shoes, a shilling or so. A shirt, more than a day's work. A printed book, several days' wages, which is why books were listed in wills. And a nobleman's income might be 2,000 pounds a year or more, against the laborer's 5 pounds, which is a ratio of 400 to 1, and the ratio in comfort was very much wider than the ratio in money, because the laborer's 5 pounds had to buy nothing but survival. That mention of the terrible years at the end of the century brings up the great economic fact of the age, which is that prices rose and did not stop. Over the course of the 1500s, the general price level in England multiplied several times over, and food rose fastest of all. Wages followed slowly and never caught up, so that a laborer's day of work bought perhaps half as much bread at the end of the century as at the beginning. The causes were argued about then and are argued about now, but they included a rising population pressing on a food supply that could not expand fast enough, a flood of silver coming into Europe from the Americas, and, in one particularly self-inflicted stretch of the middle decades, a deliberate debasement of the coinage by a government that needed money for war and paid for it by putting less silver in each coin. The result of that debasement was immediate and instructive. Prices jumped, foreign merchants discounted English money, and the crown eventually had to call the bad coin in and restore the standard at considerable cost, and the episode remained a byword for financial folly for a century afterwards. The people who did well out of a long inflation were those who held land and sold produce, which is to say the gentry and the yeomen, whose rents and prices rose. The people who did badly were those who lived on fixed rents or on wages, which is to say some of the old nobility and nearly all of the poor. That single divergence, running quietly for 100 years, redrew the English social ladder more thoroughly than any law did, and it is the reason a prosperous yeoman at the end of the century could put glass in his windows and send his son to grammar school, while a laborer in the same parish doing the same work his grandfather had done, was poorer than his grandfather had been. So Michaelmas was a day of reckoning at every rung. The steward at the manor drew up the year's account and presented it. The bailiff on the estate rendered his charge and discharge, and if the figures were wrong, there was a very uncomfortable morning. The town corporation elected its mayor for the coming year, with feasting. The universities and the law courts began their Michaelmas term, and in the village the rent was carried up the lane to the manor house in a bag, and the tenant stood in the hall while it was counted, and if it could not be paid there was a conversation, and the outcome of that conversation depended almost entirely on whether the landlord thought of himself as a lord with tenants or a proprietor with an income, which was the great slow argument of the 16th century, and one that the tenants generally lost. Michaelmas is also the moment to speak about the people who had no place on the ladder at all, because autumn was when they became most visible. A parish looked after its own. That principle was the foundation of everything, and it was not merely sentiment, it was administration. The poor of the parish, the widow with small children, the old laborer whose back had gone, the blind, the crippled, the orphan, were the responsibility of the neighbors among whom they had been born or had lawfully settled, and they were relieved by the churchwardens out of collections, out of charitable bequests, out of the profits of the parish's own small properties, and, as the century went on, out of a compulsory rate levied on the householders. This was administered face to face by men who knew every claimant personally, which made it humane and made it arbitrary in exactly equal measure. The problem was the stranger, a country with a rising population, a squeezed labor market, dissolved monasteries that had once given at the gate, and villages losing households to enclosure produced people on the road, and people on the road frightened everybody. The response of the state was a long series of statutes that grew steadily more elaborate and, at the end, considerably more sensible. The early acts were brutal, a sturdy beggar, meaning one judged able to work, could be whipped through the town and sent back to the parish of his birth. Repeat offenders faced worse. Then, gradually, over decades, a distinction hardened into law between the impotent poor, who could not work and were to be relieved, and the able poor, who could and were to be set to work, with materials of wool and flax and hemp bought at the parish's cost and given out so that there was work to be had. Overseers of the poor were appointed in every parish. A compulsory poor rate was authorized. Houses of correction were built for those who refused. And by the very end of the century, the whole structure was consolidated into the great poor law that would govern English welfare for the next 230 years, the first system of its kind in Europe, funded by local taxation, obligatory, and administered by unpaid neighbors. It was harsh, it was parochial, it tied a person's right to eat to a place on a map, and it kept England from the kind of mass destitution that its own bad harvest should have produced. Both of those things are true at once, and the century deserves to be judged on both. Crime and punishment ran on the same local machinery. There was no police force, no detective, no prosecution service. There was the hue and cry which obliged everyone within hearing to join in the pursuit of a fleeing felon. There was the parish constable, an unpaid householder serving his turn for a year, generally unenthusiastically. There were the justices of the peace, who examined and committed, and there were the assizes twice a year. at which the crown's judges arrived in the county town with trumpets and a sermon and got through an astonishing quantity of business in a few days. Trials were short, often a matter of minutes. There was no defense counsel. The jury was expected to know something about the case and the people in it. The great majority of prosecutions were for theft. And the great majority of theft was of the kind that hunger explains: sheep, grain, cloth from a hedge, a purse at a fair. The formal penalties were savage. Felony carried death by hanging, and the list of felonies was long. But the actual outcome was usually softer than the statute, because the system was riddled with mercy at every joint. Juries would deliberately undervalue stolen goods to bring an offense below the capital threshold. Judges reprieved, the crown pardoned. And there was benefit of clergy, an old survival by which a first offender who could read a verse of the Psalter, in practice the same familiar verse memorized by everybody, could escape the noose and be branded on the thumb instead, so that he could not use the trick twice. Whipping, the stocks, the pillory, and public shaming did most of the ordinary work of punishment, and shame was potent in a community where every face was known. Alongside the royal courts ran the church courts, which the people called the bawdy courts, and which policed a different territory entirely: morals, marriage, defamation, wills, tithes, and church attendance. They summoned people for fornication, for slander, for working on a Sunday, for not coming to church, for keeping an unlicensed alehouse in the churchyard, and their punishment was penance, standing in the church in a white sheet with a candle in front of the congregation on a Sunday. In a village, that was a very heavy sentence indeed. Above it all sat the terrible cases that the century is remembered for, the trials for treason and for heresy, which touched only a small number of people directly and cast a very long shadow. Religious executions ran under 3 of the century's reigns in different directions, and the men and women burned or hanged under them numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands, which is small beside contemporary Europe and enormous beside anything England had known before. For the 7 households of this story, the direct effect was mostly a matter of watchfulness. The Duchess watched her words and her correspondence and burnt letters. The knight took the oath required of him and made sure his household attended church. The mercer kept his opinions for his own parlor. The yeoman and the husbandman and the laborer changed the words they used at a funeral 3 or 4 times in a lifetime and buried their parents according to whichever form was legal that year, and went on doing what they had always done, which was to look after the living and remember the dead. Witchcraft belongs here too, and it belongs in proportion. Statutes against it were passed in this century, and prosecutions began to appear in the courts, and the accused were overwhelmingly poor older women, and the accusation typically arose out of a village quarrel, a refused loan, a refused gift at the door, followed by a misfortune, a sick cow, a dead child, a failed churning. It was neighbors accusing neighbors, and it grew from the same soil as gleaning rights and the poor rate, which is to say, the dense web of obligations between people who could not get away from each other. It never reached, in England, the scale it reached in parts of the continent. English procedure did not use torture in these cases. The courts required evidence they could weigh, and a good many accused were acquitted. But it happened, and a fair reckoning of the century has to hold it beside the glass windows and the grammar schools and the music. So the parish went into October with the harvest counted, the servants exchanged, the rents paid, the poor listed, the offenders whipped or forgiven. The accounts closed and the whole apparatus of village government wound up for another turn, and every single piece of it run by ordinary men serving an unpaid year in an office they had not asked for, which is the least romantic and most important fact about how Tudor England was actually governed. October was plowing again, and there is something restful about a year that ends where it begins. The stubble was turned under, the dung carted out from the yards where it had been building since spring and spread and plowed in, and the winter corn was sown, wheat on the best land and rye on the poorer, so that it could germinate and root before the frost and sit through the winter as a green haze on the brown. Acorns and beech mast fell, and the pigs went into the woods to fatten on them under an old rite called pannage, for which the manor took a fee, and a pig that spent October under an oak was a pig worth killing in November. The last of the fruit came in. The bracken was cut for bedding, the firs for fuel, the reeds and straw for thatching. Ditches were opened before the rains. And the corn that had come into the barn in August was now attacked with the flail again, a little at a time, as the household needed it all through the winter, because grain kept far better in the ear than in the sack. October and November were also the great season of markets and fairs, and the distinction between the two mattered. A market was weekly, held by charter in a market town on a fixed day, and it was where a village sold its surplus and bought what it could not make: a few pounds of butter, a dozen eggs, a couple of geese, a fleece, some yarn, exchanged for salt, iron, nails, tar, a cooking pot, needles, thread. A market town served an area about as wide as a person could walk in and out of in a day with a load, which is roughly 7 miles, and the whole map of England was covered in overlapping circles of that size. A fair was annual, lasted days, drew traders from 100 miles or more, and dealt in the big transactions, livestock above all, and horses, and wholesale cloth and wool. The great fairs were institutions of European importance, with their own courts sitting on the spot to settle disputes between merchants immediately, so that a trader need not wait for a term to get judgment, and those courts were known as courts of pea powder, from the French for dusty feet, which is one of the more charming pieces of legal vocabulary the Middle Ages left behind. At a fair, a yeoman bought his stock, a husbandman sold his surplus calves, a laborer's wife bought a year's worth of pins and a printed ballad, a servant was hired, a marriage was arranged, news arrived, a tooth was pulled by a man with a table and a crowd, and a bear was baited, which was popular entertainment at every rung of society and is one of the places where the centuries tastes in ours. Part company completely and permanently. All of that trade needed money, and money in Tudor England was silver, physical, and scarce. The units were pounds, shillings, and pence, 12 pence in a shilling, and 20 shillings in a pound, and the pound itself was largely an accounting concept because there was no coin of that value in common use. What people handled were pennies, halfpennies, farthings, groats worth 4pence, 6pences, shillings, and the larger silver pieces, and above them the gold coins, angels and crowns and sovereigns, which most people saw rarely and which were used for large payments, dowries and bribes. There was never enough coin. Small change was chronically short. And this is another reason credit was everywhere. A village ran on remembered debts. A shopkeeper's book recorded what every customer owed, settled at intervals, and the whole system depended on reputation, which is why defamation cases in the church courts, which look petty at first glance, were in fact economic disputes. To call a woman a scold or worse in the street was to attack the credit of her household, and the courts understood that perfectly. October brought the law terms back, and, with them, a migration. Michaelmas term filled London with gentlemen and their lawyers, because the century was extraordinarily litigious. The dissolution of the monasteries had shuffled a quarter of the land in England into new hands within a generation, and every one of those transfers eventually produced a dispute about a boundary, a right-of-way, a lease, a tithe, an entail, or a widow's jointure. The central courts at Westminster and the newer courts of equity were busier than they had ever been. And the Inns of Court were full of young men who had come to learn just enough law to defend their families' acres and to enjoy London while doing it. Their letters home form one of the best archives of the century, since they consist chiefly of requests for money, and requests for money are always honest about prices. And London, at the end of that road, was the exception to everything in this story. It was a city of perhaps 50,000 people at the century's opening, and something near 200,000 at its close, growing faster than any other city in Europe, swallowing migrants from every county because it had to, since it buried more people than it christened and could only grow by drawing them in. It was a walled medieval city with a bridge covered in houses, more than 100 parish churches, a cathedral with a spire that burned and was not rebuilt, and, sprawling beyond the walls, the suburbs where the trades that stank were pushed, and where the theaters and the bear gardens and the disreputable pleasures set up shop precisely because the city's own authority did not run there. Upriver stood Westminster, with the courts and the abbey and the palace, and between them ran the Strand, lined with the great houses of the nobility, each with its garden going down to the water, because the Thames was the city's main road and the waterman its taxi trade, and the shout to be taken across the river was as much a part of the noise of London as the bells. In that city, the mercer of this story had a factor who handled his London business, and the Duchess had a house on the Strand, and the yeoman's son at grammar school dreamed of it, and the laborer had never seen it and never would. A tenth of the country's population passed through London at some point in their lives, which for a pre-industrial society is an extraordinary figure, and it made London the machine that mixed England together, moved fashion outward, moved food and fuel inward, absorbed the ambitious and consumed the unlucky, and made the whole century audible to itself. Since the evenings were drawing in, this is the place to ask what the 16th century did for pleasure, because a year told only through work is a false year, and these were people who liked a good time and organized for it. Music came first and was everywhere. It was expected that a gentleman or gentlewoman could read a part at sight and take a line in a song after supper. And printed part books were sold for exactly that purpose. The lute was the household instrument of the educated, the virginal stood in the parlors of the wealthy, the vile consort played in the great chamber, and in the village there were pipe and tabor, fiddle, bagpipe of the old English kind, and above all voices. Ballads were the popular music of the age, and they were printed cheaply on single sheets, sold by peddlers for a penny, pasted up on alehouse walls, and sung to a small number of well-known tunes so that anybody could pick up a new one immediately. They carried news, scandal, murder, monsters, shipwrecks, love, satire, and religious controversy. And they are the closest thing the century had to a mass medium after the sermon. Dancing was constant, and was done at every rung, with the stately measures at court and the rounds and jigs on the green, and moralists disapproved of all of it in print, at length, which as usual is how we know it was popular. Games filled the rest. Bowls, tennis of the older enclosed kind, quoits, skittles, wrestling, running, football of a sort that was less a sport than a licensed riot between parishes with no discernible rules and frequent injuries, archery at the butts on a Sunday afternoon, which was required by law and increasingly ignored as firearms came in. Indoors there were cards, dice, tables, chess, and merrills. Gambling was universal, and the sums lost at court were staggering. Blood sports were popular and unquestioned, bear and bull baiting in the towns, cockfighting everywhere. And then there was the theater, which the century invented in its modern form almost by accident. It began with the old religious cycles, the mystery plays performed by the town guilds on wagons through the streets on their feast day, each craft taking the episode that suited it, so that the shipwrights built the ark and the bakers did the Last Supper, and those cycles were suppressed as the religious changes bit. Alongside them ran the traveling companies. Small troops of players under the protection of a nobleman, since the vagrancy laws would otherwise have taken them up as masterless men, who played in inn yards and town halls and great halls, and who by the last decades of the century had built permanent playhouses outside the walls of London and were performing to audiences of a couple of thousand. Standing in the yard for a penny or seated in the galleries for more, at every social level from apprentice to earl. That is the world in which the century's plays and poetry were written, and it is worth noticing that the same person who could not sign his name could quote whole speeches from a play he had stood through in the rain. Because this was a culture that heard far more than it read. Reading, though, was rising fast, and print was the reason. Books were printed in England from the 1470s onward, and by the middle of the 16th century, the trade was substantial. What was printed was not chiefly literature, it was the Bible in English, which was ordered to be set up in every parish church and chained there, and which people came in to read aloud to each other until the government became nervous and restricted who was permitted to read it. It was also almanacs, which were the best sellers of the age, containing the calendar, the movable feasts, the phases of the moon, the times of the tides, medical advice, the best days for bleeding and for sewing, and a good deal of astrology, which was taken seriously by very serious people. It was herbals, husbandry manuals, books of household management, cookery, arithmetic, and books of courtesy explaining how to behave, which sold well precisely because so many families were newly risen and did not know. Astrology brings up the 16th century's picture of the universe, which was still, for most of the century and for almost all of its people, the old one. The earth sat at the center. Around it turned the spheres, carrying the moon, the sun, the planets, and the fixed stars, and beyond them lay heaven. Everything in creation had its ordained place in a descending chain, from God through the angels to the king, the nobility, the commons, then the animals, the plants and the stones, and every rung of the earthly ladder in this story was understood to be an expression of that order rather than an accident of economics. Disorder in one part of the chain was expected to show up in another. So a comet, a monstrous birth, an eclipse, or an unnatural storm were read as commentary on the state of the kingdom and reported as news. New ideas were arriving, and by the end of the century, a small number of Englishmen were reading the astronomers who had moved the sun to the center and were quietly deciding they were right but the old picture kept its grip on the ordinary imagination long after, because it explained why things were as they were, and it gave every single person a place in the design, including the people at the bottom, which is a service that no economic system has ever managed to provide. And underneath the intellectual furniture ran the older layer of belief that no reformation touched. Charms muttered over a sick beast, a horseshoe on a door, a cunning man in the next parish who could find stolen goods and tell a girl who she would marry, the reading of the weather from the behavior of birds, the absolute conviction that the year turned in a fixed order and that the customs marking it were part of the machinery, so that if the boundaries were not beaten, the boundaries would be forgotten, and if the plow light was not paid for, the plowing would go badly. Some of that was superstition, and some of it was accumulated observation with the reasoning worn off, and the 16th century, sitting exactly on the seam between the medieval world and the modern one, held all of it in its head at once without visible discomfort. November opened with the days of the dead. The 1st of November was All Hallows, and the 2nd was All Souls, and in the older calendar these were among the most emotionally important days of the whole year, because on them the parish prayed for its own dead by name. Bells were rung through the night for the souls in purgatory. Soul cakes were baked and given out to the poor and to children who went from door to door singing for them, promising prayers in return, which is the ancestor of a custom that later crossed an ocean and came back unrecognizable. Candles burned, graves were visited. Then the reformers abolished purgatory, and with it the whole theological reason for praying for the dead, and the bell ringing was forbidden. And in parish after parish the churchwarden's accounts show the payments for it stopping and then, quietly, in some places, appearing again under another name. Whatever a government decides about the afterlife, people go on wanting to do something for their dead in November, and they did. Then, on the 11th, came Martinmas, and Martinmas was the slaughter. The animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed now. When the weather had turned cold enough to work safely with meat, and the pigs were fat from the acorns. Every household that could manage it killed a pig, and the killing of the pig was one of the fixed events of the laboring year, done with the help of neighbors who would be helped in return, and nothing whatever was wasted. The blood was caught and made into puddings the same day. The fat was rendered into lard for cooking and into tallow for candles and rushlights. The intestines were cleaned for casings. The head became brawn, set in its own jelly. The hams and the flitches of bacon were rubbed with salt and saltpetre and laid in a trough or a barrel for weeks, then hung in the chimney to take the smoke. And that flitch hanging in the roof was the single most important object in a cottage, because it was the household's fat and protein for the next 9 months, and to lose it was a catastrophe. The trotters were eaten fresh, the bristles were kept for brushes, the bladder became a football or a container. What was left went to the dogs and the midden. On a bigger farm the same was done with a bullock, and beef was salted down in barrels in brine strong enough to float an egg. In the great house the deer were culled in the park, and the venison distributed as gifts, because venison could not legally be sold and therefore functioned as pure social currency, a haunch to the neighbor whose support was wanted in a lawsuit, being worth a great deal more than its weight in mutton. Salt itself was therefore one of the most important commodities in England. Produced by evaporating seawater on the coasts and by boiling brine from inland springs, carried inland along old salt roads whose names survive on the map. and decked, argued about, and adulterated. Alongside the salting came the candle making, which was a November job in every household above the very poorest, dipping wicks of twisted flax again and again into a pot of melted tallow so that the layers built up, or pouring it into molds if the household owned any. It took hours and it smelled ferociously, and the result had to last the winter. Wood was stacked. Thatch was patched. Windows were stuffed. Shutters were repaired. The wheels of the year were greased. And in the parlor or the hall, the woman of the house went through the linen and the stores and reckoned what there was against how long the winter would be, which is the calculation that stands behind every proverb about Candlemas. November was also, above all other months, when people died. And it is worth ending the year's practical business with how the century handled death, because it handled it far better than it handled almost anything else. Death was not hidden. It happened at home, in a room full of relatives and neighbors, and the dying person was expected to take an active part in it. A good death meant knowing it was coming, setting one's affairs in order. Forgiving and being forgiven, making a will, and dying in one's right mind with prayers being said. The will itself was often made on the deathbed, dictated to the parish priest or the schoolmaster or a literate neighbor, and it usually opened by committing the soul to God, in a formula whose exact wording changed with the century's religious weather, and then set about the goods. And those wills are why we know so much about these households, because probate required an inventory, and the inventory was made by 4 honest neighbors who walked through the house room by room, listing everything in it with a valuation. Thousands of them survive. They tell us that a yeoman's hall held a table board and a form and 2 chairs and a cupboard with pewter on it. That his chamber held a joined bedstead with a feather bed and a bolster and a coverlet and a chest, that the buttery held barrels, that the kitchen held a great brass pot and a spit and a pair of pothooks, and that in the barn there was corn unthreshed to a certain value. They tell us that a laborer's whole estate came to a few pounds. And they tell us, more clearly than any chronicle, how the century got richer, because you can watch the beds and the pewter and the glass and the cushions creep down the ladder decade by decade. The funeral came next and was scaled precisely to rank. At the top, it was a spectacle, arranged by the heralds, with a procession, mourners in issued black gowns paid for by the estate, a hearse of wood and candles in the church, banners and hatchments in the sermon, followed by a dinner and by doles of money and bread to the poor who attended, since a great crowd of grateful poor at a funeral was itself a statement about the dead man. At the bottom it was a shroud, a parish coffin used to carry the body and then returned, a grave in the churchyard, the neighbors walking behind, a bell, and a drink afterwards. In the middle it was everything in between. What all of them shared was that the entire community turned out, that the passing bell was rung so that everyone in earshot knew that a soul had gone, and could, according to the decade, pray for it or simply pause, and that the parish register recorded the name. That register, kept by law from the 1530s onward in every parish in England, listing every baptism, marriage, and burial, is the century's most quietly revolutionary invention. For the first time, ordinary people entered the written record simply for existing. A laborer whose name appears nowhere else in any document on earth appears there 3 times, born, married, buried, in a hand that is faded to brown, in a book kept in a chest, with 3 locks in a church that is very probably still standing. And that, more than the palaces, is why we can tell this year at all. By the beginning of December, the light had gone almost entirely. There were, at best, 7.5 usable hours between sunrise and sunset, and in dirty weather rather fewer, and the whole country adjusted by moving indoors and slowing down. This is the moment to walk through a single ordinary day at the top of the ladder and then at the bottom, and to notice that they were not opposite so much as the same shape, drawn at two very different sizes. In the great house, the day began before the family woke, because the household began earlier. Fires were laid and lit by servants who had slept in the rooms below or on pallets in the passages. Water was carried. The bakehouse had been working since long before dawn. The lord or lady woke in a curtained bed in a chamber, said morning prayers, and was dressed by attendants in a process that took the better part of an hour and involved, for a woman of rank, a smock, stockings tied with garters, a petticoat, a farthingale, a kirtle, a stiffened bodice with the sleeves pinned on separately, a gown over all of it, a partlet at the neck, a girdle, and a headdress, with everything fastened by pins and points and laces because buttons were decorative and hooks were rare, so that dressing genuinely required another pair of hands. Then chapel. Then breakfast, if breakfast was taken at all, which for adults was often skipped, or was a piece of bread and a cup of ale standing up. The morning was business, and the business of a great household was correspondence. Estate accounts, suits, patronage, visitors, and the hearing of requests, and the household officers came and went with their books. Dinner was the main meal and came in the late morning between 10 and noon, served in the great chamber for the family and in the hall for everyone else, with the ceremony of the table observed carefully. Hands washed at the board from an ewer and basin, Grace said. The carver working at the sideboard, dishes brought in courses, and the whole thing over in an hour. The afternoon was for riding, hunting, hawking, the garden, the long gallery in bad weather, music, reading, sewing, and the receiving of neighbors. Supper came at 5 or 6. The evening was cards, music, talk, perhaps a play if there were players in the district, and prayers. And bed early by our standards, and then the first sleep, and the interval, and the second sleep. In the cottage at the lane's end the same day existed, with everything stripped away except the necessary. Waking in the dark to the sound of the household breathing, the fire uncovered from its ash, where it had been banked to keep alive, blown back into flame with a few sticks, because relighting from nothing meant flint and steel and tinder and patience, and everyone preferred not to. A drink of the previous night's small ale, bread if there was bread, out into the cold. The man went where the work was, threshing in a neighbor's barn, hedging, ditching, carting, whatever the season and the hiring allowed, and came home at dusk. The woman's day did not have that shape because it never stopped, and it ran the fire, the pot, the garden, the geese, the pig, the children, the water carried from the well, the wood gathered, the spinning that went on in every spare moment and in company with other women at a neighbor's fire, and the small trade in eggs and butter and yarn that put actual coin into a household that otherwise saw very little. The children fetched and carried and minded each other. The meal was pottage, the light was the fire. The evening was talk, and the talk was the day's news and the parish's business and stories that everybody had heard before, and then the same two sleeps under the same thatch, with the animals shifting behind the partition and the smoke lying in a layer above their heads. Between those two extremes stood the other 5, each with the same day differently furnished. The merchant's day was shop and warehouse and council. The knight's day was estate and sessions and hospitality. The yeoman's day was land and stock and market and the schooling of his son. The husbandman's day was the same with less of everything and more worry. The servant's day belonged to somebody else from waking to sleeping, which is the definition of service and was accepted as the ordinary condition of youth. Advent, meanwhile, was running, the 4 weeks of fasting and preparation before Christmas. In the older calendar, a genuinely austere season of no meat and no marriages and no feasting, and by the end of the century, a rather thinner observance kept mainly by the devout. Underneath it, the practical preparations went on with increasing urgency because everyone knew what was coming. The great household ordered in. Its accounts for December are the most spectacular of the year, listing oxen and sheep and swans and capons and wildfowl by the dozen and the hundred, wine by the ton, spices by the pound, wax by the hundredweight, and the wages of extra cooks and musicians and players. The manor house laid in a great deal less and still a great deal more than usual. And the mistress and her maids spent the last fortnight baking, spicing, brewing the strong Christmas ale, and preparing the gifts that would go out to tenants and neighbors. The mercer's wife did the same on a town scale, and the mercer put his best cloth in the window, because the 12 days were the buying season for anyone who intended to appear at any gathering. The yeoman killed something. The husbandman brewed, and the laborer's wife, who had nothing to lay in, did what everyone at her rung did, which was to make sure that the flitch was safe and that the household would be at the manor when the hall was opened, because the 12 days were the only time in the year when the food at the top of the ladder was pushed, deliberately and ceremonially, all the way down to the bottom of it. That pushing down is not incidental. It is the whole logic of the Tudor Christmas. A great man's obligation was hospitality, and the measure of him locally was what his gate looked like at Christmas, and the preachers and pamphleteers of the century complained bitterly and constantly that the old hospitality was dying, that lords now kept Christmas in London instead of in the country, that the hall stood empty, that the poor were turned away, and that everything had been better in the days of their grandfathers. Every century says this. In this one it happened to be partly true, because the rich were discovering the town season and the country hall was quieter than it had been. But not yet, and not everywhere, and not this year, because in the last days of December the fires went up in the great hall, the bows went up on the screen, the trestle tables came out, the barrels were broached, and the whole enormous and expensive business of proving that the household was generous began again, exactly as it had at the very start of this long night, when the frost came down on the 10th of January and 7 households woke into the same cold. So the year closes where it opened, in the dark with the fires up. Christmas Day itself began in church, at every rung without exception, because attendance was required by law and because everybody wanted to be there anyway. Then the eating began, and it went on with interruptions for more church for 12 days. At court the household swelled, and the hall filled, and the Lord of Misrule was appointed again, and the disguisings were rehearsed, and the players came in, and the gambling started. In the great chamber, the family and their guests ate off silver and gilt. And in the hall below them, 150 people ate off pewter and wood. And at the gate, the parish ate what came out of the kitchen afterwards, and all 3 of those things were understood to be parts of the same meal. At the manor the hall was open to the tenants, And the knight sat with his wife at the high table, and every man who farmed his land came in with his family, and was fed, and given ale, and went home with something. And the accounts of such households show the buying of extra bread and beef and cheese explicitly for that purpose. In the town, the guilds feasted, the corporation feasted, the waits played through the streets in the dark mornings, and the apprentices were let loose. On the yeoman's farm there was a goose or a joint of beef, a great fire, the strong ale that had been brewed in November, neighbors in, cards, and singing. In the husbandman's house there was less of all of it, and the same shape. And in the cottage at the lane's end there was, for once, meat, and enough of it, and it had come from the manor. The food of the season was already recognizable. There was roast beef where beef could be had, and in the greater houses a boar's head brought in with ceremony, and there was the goose. There was plum pottage, a thick spiced broth of meat and dried fruit and spice and breadcrumbs, which over the following 2 centuries would slowly thicken and lose its meat and become the Christmas pudding. There was mince pie, which at this date genuinely contained minced meat as well as dried fruit and spice, and which the sterner sort of reformer disliked on the grounds that it was shaped like a manger. There was gingerbread and marchpane at the wealthy tables, and comfits, and spiced ale. There was the wassail bowl, carried from house to house in some districts and taken out to the orchard in others, where the trees were toasted and shouted at, and had cider poured at their roots to ensure the coming crop. A custom of enormous antiquity that the church spent several centuries failing to suppress and eventually settled for ignoring. There were carols, which were dance songs before there were hymns, and which were sung by anybody at all. There were the mummers, who came to the door in disguise and performed a short violent comic play in which a hero was killed and then revived by a doctor, and who then required feeding. And through all of it ran the licensed-in version of the season, the fool in charge. The boy bishop in some cathedrals preaching a sermon in the place of the real one, the servants sitting while the master served, the whole latter briefly and safely turned upside down on the clear understanding that it would be the right way up again by the middle of January. New Year's Day was the day for gifts, not Christmas Day. And the gift-giving went both up and down the ladder in a carefully calibrated exchange. Tenants brought capons and cheeses and eggs to the manor. The manor gave back cloth and money and food. Courtiers gave the monarch jewels, purses of gold, embroidered sleeves, elaborate clocks, and in one famous instance, a pair of knitted silk stockings that changed English fashion permanently. The monarch gave back gilt plate by weight, and the entire transaction was written down on both sides. Because a gift in this century was not a private kindness, it was a public statement of a relationship, and the relationship was the point. Then Twelfth Night, and the last and greatest feast, and the cake with a bean baked in it, and whoever found the bean was king of the evening. And then the 6th of January, and the bows came down, and the fires were let out in half the rooms, and the plow went through the village street on the first Monday afterwards, and the whole thing began again. That is 1 year in Tudor England, at every rung of the ladder from the court to the cottage. What is worth carrying away from it as you lie there in the dark is not the pageantry, which was real, but which was also always a performance. It is the shape underneath. Consider what the 7 households actually shared. They shared the weather, absolutely and without appeal, and no amount of money bought away around a wet August. They shared the calendar, and a duchess and a laborer marked the same feast on the same day and knew what it meant. They shared the parish, since the great man's family and the cottager's family were baptized at the same font, married at the same rail, and buried in the same ground, with only the depth and the marker differing. They shared the light and the dark, and both went to bed early because both had to. They shared a diet built on bread and ale, differing enormously in the trimmings and not at all in the foundation. And they shared an assumption which almost nobody in the century seriously questioned, that the ladder itself was the natural order of things, ordained, permanent, and on the whole, benign, and that the duty of the top was to protect and feed, and the duty of the bottom was to work and obey. What separated them was equally clear and rather more brutal. It was security before anything else. The Duchess could lose a harvest and would notice it only in her accounts. The laborer could lose a harvest and would bury a child. It was food in February. It was the ability to leave a place where the plague had come. It was heat and space and quiet and clean linen. It was the sheer number of years a person could expect to be given, and even that was less unequal than one might think, because infection took infants out of palaces as readily as out of cottages, and the great difference in life expectancy between the rungs was made not in old age, but in the first 5 years, and then again in any year when the bread ran out. And it was choice. A gentleman's son chose between the law, the church, the estate, and the court. A laborer's son chose between the work in his own parish and the work in the next one. But the century did not stand still, and by the end of it, the latter had a certain amount of traffic on it, which is the genuinely new thing about the 16th century in England. The monasteries fell, and their land went on to the market, and families who had been prosperous farmers 3 generations before were sitting as gentlemen in houses built out of abbey stone. Trade made merchants richer than knights. The law made the sons of yeomen into judges. The church made the sons of tradesmen into bishops. Grammar school Latin was the ladder within the ladder, and the century built enough grammar schools that a clever boy in a small town had a genuine, if narrow, road out. Meanwhile, inflation quietly demoted others, and old families that lived on fixed rents and refused to farm commercially slid down while their tenants rose. The people at the very bottom did not move at all, and in real terms they moved backwards, and the poor law was written to catch them when they fell. It is a mixed and honest picture, and it is the reason the century feels so alive at this distance. It was a society that believed absolutely in a fixed order, at the exact moment when its own economy had begun to shuffle everybody around. So let the year end properly, household by household, the way a steward would close a book. The Duchess ends her year at a great house in the country with the hall full and her accounts in front of her, and she has, over 12 months, arranged 2 marriages, secured 1 wardship, lost 1 lawsuit, buried a nephew, spent more on cloth than her whole estate spent on wages, and gained a little ground at court, which is the only currency she truly banks. She will be at another palace by February. The knight ends his year at the manor with the tenants fed, the sessions attended, the accounts balanced, 400 acres in hand, 2 sons at school and a daughter to be settled, and 1 running quarrel with a neighbor about a watercourse that will outlive them both and be inherited by their heirs like a piece of furniture. The mercer ends his year with the shop shuttered for the feast, a warehouse half empty, a factor in London who owes him money, 2 apprentices who have nearly served their time, a seat on the council retained by a margin of 1 vote, and a new gown of good black cloth that says everything about him he wishes said. The yeoman ends his year with the barn full, the winter wheat sown and greening, the flock housed, 140 lambs raised, the rent for his own small tenancies collected, the son at the grammar school construing Latin badly, pewter on the shelf, glass in 2 windows and a chimney that draws, and a quiet and entirely accurate sense that his family is rising. The husbandman ends his year with the seed corn repaid, the pig killed, the rent found, 1 cow lost in the spring and 1 calf gained in the autumn, and the knowledge that he is exactly where he began, which in that century counts as a very good year indeed. The laborer ends his year with the flitch in the roof, the garden dug over, a fortnight of harvest wages spent long ago, a child buried in March and a child born in October. Work promised for the threshing and nothing promised after Candlemas, and a Christmas dinner eaten in a hall he does not own, given by a man he has never spoken to alone. And the servants and the apprentices end their year hired to somebody new, walking a lane with a bundle, saving a wage they have not yet been paid, waiting for the moment they can take a holding or a shop and stop being part of somebody else's household and start one of their own. That is the ladder at the end of one turn. Now step back from it, gently, because this is the last thing. Almost everything in this story is still there, if you know how to look. The parish churches are still standing, a great many of them, with the medieval fabric underneath and the 16th century's changes written all over them. An empty niche where an image stood, a blocked stair that once climbed to a rude loft, a lime-washed wall with the ghost of a painting coming faintly back through, a tomb with a knight and his wife in ruffs and their children kneeling in a row. Along the base, the sons behind the father and the daughters behind the mother, with the ones who died as infants shown smaller and holding skulls. The registers are still in their boxes, moved to a county archive now, with the same names in the same brown ink. The great houses that were built to entertain a monarch still stand at the ends of their avenues. And the glass that scandalized the neighbors is still in the windows. The market towns still hold markets on the same weekday charters granted 5 and 6 centuries ago. The field patterns are underneath the modern ones, and in low winter light you can still see the corrugation of the old strip plowing across a hillside like a tide mark. The green humps of the vanished villages are still in the turf. The hedges laid in a January 500 years ago are still growing, having been laid again perhaps 40 times since by men who learned the technique from men who learned it from them. The salt roads are still roads. The words are still in the language, the tenterhooks and the by-hook, or by-crook, and the upper crust and the curfew, worn smooth and detached from the things they described. And the shape of the year is still faintly there in the calendar, in the quarter days that still govern rents in parts of England, in the harvest festival in a village church, in the fact that we still feel that January is a beginning and that the 12 days at the end of December are outside ordinary time. History does not disappear. It gets built over, plowed under, forgotten and half remembered, and then it simply becomes the ground beneath our feet, and we walk on it without noticing. In warm houses, in a country that no longer has to watch the sky in August. What the 16th century would find most astonishing about us is not the machines. It is the light. That we can, at any hour of any night, make a room as bright as noon for less than the cost of a thought, when they measured out a rush dipped in mutton fat and made it last half an hour. And what they would recognize instantly without a word of explanation, is the thing you are doing right now, which is lying awake in the dark hours listening to a voice. In the interval between the first sleep and the second, exactly as they did 500 years ago, in a bed shared with other people, under a roof of thatch, with the fire banked and the frost coming down outside on the whole quiet, sleeping, ordinary country. There are a few small things left over, the sort that fall out of the bottom of a year, and they are worth setting down quietly before the light goes. The first is washing, which the 16th century did more of than its reputation suggests, and differently from us. Full immersion in hot water was rare, partly because it took an enormous amount of fuel and labor to heat and carry, and partly because the medicine of the age held that a hot bath opened the pores and let disease in, which was a reasonable inference from the observation that bathhouses were where people caught things. What replaced it was daily washing of the hands and face in a basin, washing of the hands before and after every meal at table as a matter of strict manners, the rubbing of the body and the teeth with clean linen cloths, and above all the frequent changing of the linen next to the skin. The white shirt or smock was the garment that touched the body, and it was believed to draw the dirt out of the skin into itself, so a clean shirt was cleanliness, and the display of a strip of white linen at the collar and the cuffs was therefore a statement of hygiene as much as of wealth. A rich man might have 30 shirts and change daily. A laborer had 2 and changed weekly, and washed one while wearing the other. Teeth were rubbed with a cloth and a powder of salt or ash or herbs, and were generally sound in the poor and appalling in the rich for the reason already given. Hair was combed rather than washed and was mostly covered, and every woman above the age of marriage wore a coif or a hood in public, and every man wore a hat almost constantly, indoors as well as out, removing it as a mark of respect, which is where every hat custom in the language comes from. Lice and fleas were universal and were treated as weather, combated with fine combs. Herbs strewn in the bed, and resignation. Shaving was done by a barber with a razor and hot water, and was a social occasion. The second is the bed itself, which was the most valuable thing in most houses, and was accordingly the thing most often mentioned in wills, sometimes by name, sometimes with the exact hangings specified, and sometimes left to one child at the express and pointed exclusion of another. The best bed had a wooden frame, a lattice of ropes that had to be tightened periodically with a peg, a mattress of straw or chaff underneath, and a feather bed on top, a bolster, pillows, sheets of linen, blankets of wool and a coverlet, and curtains hung on a tester frame, which were not decoration but insulation and privacy in a room where other people slept. Beneath it stood a truckle bed on wheels for a servant or a child, pushed away in the daytime. Below that rung, a bed was a stuffed sack on a bench or on the floor, and below that it was straw and a blanket, and the difference between those things was one of the sharpest lines on the whole ladder, which is exactly why a feather bed in an inventory is such a reliable sign that a family had arrived. The third is the noise. It is very difficult now to imagine how quiet the 16th century was and how far a sound carried in it. There was no machine noise of any kind except the watermill and the windmill, which groaned and knocked and were audible across a valley. The loudest regular sound in an English life was the church bell, and bells did an extraordinary amount of work, ringing the hours, the services, the curfew, the alarm, the passing of a soul, the celebration of a wedding, the news of a victory, and each parish's ring was recognizable to the people who lived under it. Below that came the sounds of animals, dogs and geese and cattle and a cockerel that was the alarm clock of the entire nation, the creak of cartwheels on a rutted road, the ring of a hammer at the smithy, the flail in the barn, the whetstone on the scythe, the shouts of the plowman to his oxen, and, in the towns, the street cries of the sellers, each trade with its own recognizable call, and a watchman's voice at night. And when all of those stopped, at night, in winter, in a village, the silence was total in a way that virtually nobody alive now has heard, which is one more reason people talked so much, sang so much, and remembered so much by heart. The fourth is the weather lore, which was not superstition so much as compressed observation handed down in a portable form. A red sky at night, a ring around the moon, rain before 7, fine before 11, swallows flying low, cattle lying down, the blackthorn flowering before its leaves, when the oak comes out before the ash, and when the ash comes before the oak. St. Swithin's Day on the 15th of July, which was held to set the pattern for the following 40 days. Candlemas being bright. Every one of those had been tested against 1,000 years of English weather by people whose lives depended on getting it right, and a fair number of them are, in fact, mildly predictive, which is more than can be said for most of the century's medicine. And the last thing is the shape of the whole turn, which you can now say in one breath. Frost and threshing and the 12 days and the plow dragged through the street. Candlemas and the counting of the hay and Lent and the salted fish and the hungry weeks, Lady Day and the rent and the plowing and the sowing and the manicourt and the swallow. Easter and the lambs and the first grass and the roads opening in the ships. May and the boughs and the maypole and the beating of the bounds and the courting. June and the scythes in the meadow and the shearing and the bonfires and the corn coming into ear. July and the progress on the road and the weeding and the sickness and the highest prices of the year. August and Lammas and the reapers in a line and the stooks and the last load dressed with green boughs and the harvest supper in the barn. September and Michaelmas and the accounts and the fair with the mop and the crook and the shilling in the hand. October and the plowing again and the pigs in the oak wood and the fair and the term. November and the dead remembered and the pig killed and the salt and the candles and the smoke in the chimney. December and the dark and the laying in and the fires going up and the hall opened and the whole quiet country eating for 12 days rather better than it could afford. And then the frost again, and the 7 beds, and the same cold morning arriving at all of them at the same hour. One more left over, and then the light. Twice or 3 times in that year, at the summons of the county's Lord Lieutenant, the men of the parish walked to the nearest muster field and stood to be counted. England kept no standing army worth the name, and its defense rested on an ancient obligation that every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 should have arms according to his means and should appear with them when called. So the muster roll listed them by name and by weapon, and the yeoman came with a bow or a bill, and the husbandman came with whatever the parish armor chest could lend him, and the knight came mounted and equipped and was expected to bring men with him, and the Duchess's household provided a contingent whose cost came out of her rents. Later in the century, the trained bands were formed out of the better men and drilled properly with pike and musket, and the longbow, which had won the famous battles of the previous age, was argued over furiously by old men who insisted it still outshot a firearm and was quietly retired anyway. Most of those musters ended in nothing but a walk home and a drink. Occasionally they ended in a march to the Scottish border, or to a coast where beacons had been lit on the hilltops in a chain that could carry a warning the length of England in a night, or, in one famous summer near the Century's close, to a camp on the Essex shore while a great fleet came up the channel and the whole country stood still and listened. And beyond that shore, the Century was doing something that none of the 7 households in this story would live to understand the size of. English ships were going further every decade, to the Newfoundland fisheries, to the Baltic, to Russia by the northern route, to the Mediterranean, to the coast of Africa, across the Atlantic, and eventually right around the world. And joint stock companies were being chartered to pay for it, and the first attempts at settlement on the far side of the ocean were made and failed and were made again. From the cottage at the lane's end, all of that arrived as rumor, as a ballad sung at the fair about a sea fight, as a strange root or a strange word, as a piece of news half heard and passed on. The laborer of this story never saw the sea. His great-grandchildren would cross it. And that, too, is what a century is. A slow accumulation of small, ordinary years in which nothing appears to change, at the end of which everything has. So let the whole century settle now, the way dust settles in a barn after the flail has stopped. Let the palace go quiet, with its 1,000 candles guttering down in the great chamber and the servants raking the fires. Let the manor house go quiet, with the trestle tables taken down and the rushes swept and the dogs asleep across the hearth. Let the town go quiet, the shutters up, the last cart gone from the marketplace, the watchman calling the hour and hearing nothing back. Let the farm go quiet, the barn doors shut on the stacked sheaves, the byre warm with the breath of cattle, the stone chimney breathing a thin, straight thread of smoke into a windless sky. And let the cottage at the lane's end go quiet too, with the fire banked under its ash to be woken in the morning, the flitch of bacon dark in the roof, the spinning wheel still, and the whole household lying close together under one blanket in the dark, warm, breathing slowly 500 years upstream of you and doing exactly what you are doing. There is nothing left to do tonight. The rent has been paid, the corn is in, the hay is stacked and thatched, the pig is salted, the candles are made, the door is shut against the frost, and the year has gone round once more. As it always does, as it did before any of them, and as it will long after all of us. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet night waiting for you on the screen, another century to walk through slowly, and it will still be there whenever you want it. If this one helped you rest, a like and a subscribe do help these videos find other people lying awake in the dark, and it costs you nothing at all. And do leave your location and your local time in the comments before you go, because somebody scrolling at 4 a.m. on the other side of the world will read it and feel a great deal less alone. Now let the last of it go. Let the frost lie on the fields. Let the bells keep their silence until morning. Let your shoulders come down and your jaw unclench and your breathing go long and slow and even, the way it does in the interval between the first sleep and the second, when there is nothing to do but lie warm in the dark and wait for the light to come back, which it always does, and always has, and always will. Close your eyes. Good night, and sweet dreams.